Genevieve Laurent looked straight at me, raised her glass, and said to her brother in French, Elle a apporté une tarte, comme une femme de ménage qui s'excuse. She brought a pie, like a cleaning woman apologizing, and the whole table laughed. My son laughed too because he didn't understand a word of it, and he thought the sound of laughter meant it was going well. I sat there with my hands in my lap, and I did the thing I'd been doing for 30 years. I smiled. But what none of them knew, what my own son had never known in 30 years of living under my roof, was that I understood every syllable, every one. And I had understood them since I was 25 years old in a kitchen in Lyon, learning them the hard way. Comment the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. My name is Eleanor Whitmore. I'm 64 years old, and I need to start by telling you something that isn't flattering. I let it happen, all of it. Every laugh, every look, every bless your heart in a foreign language. Nobody stole my voice. I put it down myself, one small choice at a time over about 30 years, and by the time I sat down at that table in Charleston, I'd been quiet so long I wasn't sure I remembered how to be anything else. So don't feel sorry for me yet. Feel sorry for me at the part where I helped my 9-year-old son with his Spanish flashcards. We'll get there. It started with dishwater. Tuesday in April, and I had my hands in the sink when the phone rang, and I remember thinking, if that's the pharmacy about the refill, again I'm going to say something I regret. It was Nathan. Mom, are you sitting down? I'm at the sink. Sit down. I'm 64, not 94. Say it. He laughed, and then he said it. I asked her. I asked Amélie. She said yes. I put my hand flat on the counter, and I stood in a kitchen that hadn't changed in 20 years in a wet apron, and I cried without making a single sound because crying quietly is a thing widows learn in the first year and never lose. Mom, you there? I'm here, baby. You're crying. It's the dish soap. Mom, it's a very strong dish soap, Nathan. And he laughed so hard I had to move the phone away from my ear, and for about 90 seconds, I was the happiest woman in North Carolina. 90 seconds. Then he said, So, there's a thing. What thing? Her parents want to have you down. Charleston. I turned the water off. They have a place in Charleston. It's a big place, Mom. How big, Mom? How big, Nathan? A pause. And then my son said, It has a name. And I sat down. Here's what I knew about the Laurents before that phone call. Victor made his money in international shipping law, which Nathan explained to me twice, and which I understood exactly none of. Genevieve was born in France and had never in 61 years allowed a single human being to forget it. They had a house with a name, and in 3 years of dating my son, they had never once asked to meet me. 3 years. Not a birthday, not a lunch, not a how do you do. Now 1 month before the wedding, they wanted a dinner. Why now, I asked him. What do you mean, why now? 3 years, Nathan. Why now? They're busy people, Mom. So am I. You're retired. That is not the same as not busy, and you know it. He did the sigh, the one where I can hear him dragging his hand down his face. Mom, please. Genevieve told Amélie she wants to know you before the wedding. And something in my stomach went cold, because there are 2 ways a person can use that word. One means I want to be close to you. The other one means I want to find out what you are. But my son sounded so happy. When? Saturday after next. What do I wear? Wear whatever you want. Nathan Whitmore, that is the most useless sentence in the English language. Wear the navy dress. Mom, they're not going to be looking at your dress. Remember that he said that. My son, who loves me, who would step in front of a truck for me, honestly believed that nobody was going to look at my dress. I called Delia that night. Delia Rourke has known me since we were both 22. She's the only living person who knew me before the Yellow House, before Nathan, before Ray, before I got small. They invited you to the plantation house, she said. Not a question. It's not a plantation. Ellie, it's a house. Ellie, are you going to tell them? Tell them what? And Delia, 71 years old, 4'11", has never let me get away with one single thing. In 42 years said don't Don't do that to me and don't do it to yourself. You know exactly what." I sat down on the edge of my bed in the dark. There's nothing to tell. 9 years. 40 years ago. So it isn't a thing, Delia. You don't sit at a stranger's table and start reading your resume out loud like some sad woman at a church potluck. Nobody said read it. I said say it. Same thing. It is not the same thing, and the fact that you can't tell the difference anymore. She stopped. I heard her breathe, and then quiet. Ellie, when's the last time you said her name out loud? Whose name? Yours. I hung up on her. I'm not proud of it. She called back 20 minutes later. I answered, and neither of us mentioned it. That's how you stay friends for 42 years. But I hung up on her, and I sat in the dark, and I knew she'd put her thumb directly on the bruise. Because there was a woman I used to be, and I hadn't said her name out loud in 30 years. Let me tell you about the spoon. 1986. I'm 26 years old, and I'm standing in a kitchen in the Croix-Rousse, up the hill in Lyon, in a restaurant called Le Vieux Marché. The chef's name was Gilbert. He had a temper like a house fire and hands like a bricklayer, and on my first day, he stood in the middle of that kitchen and announced at volume to everyone that he did not want an American girl in his kitchen. I lasted because I outlasted. I scrubbed, then I peeled. Then I stood at the pass while he screamed at me about my knife angle in a language I was still bleeding to learn. 3 years of l'Américaine, 3 years of him not using my name, and then one night in my 3rd year he put me on the sauces. You need to understand what that meant. That man's father died in that kitchen, right there on the line at 62 years old, and Gilbert gave the sauces to me. The first night I got it right. The first night the sauce broke and I brought it back the way he'd taught me. He tasted it off the back of a spoon. He didn't say anything. He just nodded once and handed the spoon back. And I went out into the alley and stood against the brick with that spoon still in my hand shaking, and I thought nobody in Greensboro would believe this. That turned out to be more true than I ever knew. Nathan drove me down. 3 hours and 20 minutes. Navy dress in a garment bag in the back. Apple pie on my lap. Mom put the pie in the back. It'll slide. It's not going to slide. It'll slide, Nathan. He glanced at me. You're nervous. I'm not nervous. You're holding that pie like it owes you money. I am fine. And then, an hour outside Charleston, he said something I've never forgotten. Hey, Mom, just don't let them, you know. I looked at him. Don't let them what? He did a thing with his shoulders, a little shrug. Nothing. Forget it. Nathan. It's nothing. Nathan. And my son. My kind, decent 30-year-old son, who has never said one cruel word to me in his life, kept his eyes on the road and said, they can be a lot. That's all. Don't let them get in your head. Which is a thing you only say when you already know what's coming. He knew. He knew, and he brought me anyway because he loved her, and he wanted his mother at his wedding table, and he'd been hoping that if he just got us all in one room, it would fix itself. 30 years old. Still thinks rooms fix things. The house had a gate. I'll tell you 2 things about that house, and then I'll never describe it again. The first is that the gate had a speaker in the wall, and my son had to lean out his window and say, "It's Nathan and my mother," into a box, and a woman's voice said, "Of course," in a way that meant of course, and also meant something else entirely. The second is that there were 3 cars in that driveway, and Nathan's was the 4th, and before he got out, my son looked at his own car. He looked at his own car. I watched him do it, and I thought, oh, honey. They'd been in his head for years. Genevieve opened the door herself. She was beautiful. That matters, so I'll say it. She was beautiful the way an expensive knife is beautiful. Everything about her had a purpose, and none of it was decoration. "Eleanor," she said, "at last." And she took both my hands, both of them. She held my hands out to the sides, and she looked at me head to foot, one full pass about 1.5 seconds, and she smiled and said, "You must be exhausted from the drive." If you've ever sat in a room and pretended not to hear something, you already know exactly what that sentence was. That sentence is a woman looking at another woman's shoes and finding a polite way to mention them. "It was 3 hours," I said. "I've had longer." "Of course you have." And she was already turning away. Victor, they're here. And then over her shoulder in French to someone in the next room, not lowering her voice, because why would you lower your voice? Elle a apporté quelque chose. She's brought something. Not she brought a pie, not how thoughtful. She's brought something, like I'd tracked in mud. And that was the first second of it. That's the moment I want you to hold on to, because I made a decision right there in that hallway, and it took me about a second and a half, and it was the worst decision of my adult life. I decided not to understand. Sit with that. It's the hardest sentence in this whole story, and it's the one I'm most ashamed of. I had a choice. Standing in that hallway with a pie in my hands, I had a choice, and I had it 100 more times before the night was over, and every single time I chose to be a woman who doesn't speak French. Because the other thing meant a scene. It meant Nathan's face. It meant Amélie caught in the middle of her own family. It meant being the mother-in-law who made things awkward at the dinner before the wedding forever. In every version of that story, that family told for the next 40 years. So I smiled, and I handed her the pie, and I said, "It's apple. I make it every year." And Genevieve Laurent held it out at arm's length, and said, "How sweet," and set it down on a side table, not the kitchen, a side table in a hallway. It sat there all night. I watched it sit there all night. Jean passing. Victor came out of his study with his hand already extended. "Eleanor, Victor Laurent, welcome." Firm handshake, direct eye contact, a completely, genuinely pleasant man. And I need you to understand this about Victor, because people want him to be a monster, and he wasn't. He was worse than a monster. He was comfortable. "Nathan tells me you're in Greensboro, just outside, little town called Marbury." Marbury. He repeated it the way you repeat a word in a foreign language you don't intend to learn. "And you're retired now." "I am." "From how? Bookkeeping, 22 years. Medical practice." "Bookkeeping." A slow nod. "Steady work." "Steady work." Nathan jumped in too fast. "Mom ran the whole back office," Dr. Ellis said when she retired. "It took 3 people to replace her." Nathan. "It's true, Mom." Nathan. And Victor smiled at both of us, warm as a fireplace, and said, "Well, a mother's son," and walked into the dining room. Amélie found me before dinner, came around a corner fast, and grabbed my arm above the elbow. "Eleanor? Hi. Okay, so, my parents. Your parents are lovely. Eleanor, they're lovely, sweetheart. And this girl, 29 years old, my son's fiancée, a girl who took her shoes off at my door the first time she came to my house without being asked, looked at me with her jaw set and said, 'If my father says one thing to you tonight, one thing, you tell me. You don't have to be polite in this house. You tell me.' And I patted her hand, and I said, 'Nobody's saying anything, honey.' She didn't believe me. She stood there another 2 full seconds looking at me. Then she said, 'Okay,' and let go of my arm and walked into that dining room ahead of me with her shoulders squared like a woman going into a deposition. I lied to that girl to protect her father's feelings. Read that again. I lied to that girl to protect her father's feelings. That's what 30 years of being small does to a person. It doesn't just make you quiet, it makes you complicit. 7 of us at the table. Victor, Genevieve, Amélie, Nathan, Genevieve's brother Mark in from Bordeaux, Mark's wife Claudine, me. Mark spoke maybe 40 words of English and used about 9 of them all night. "Hello. Thank you. Very nice. Please." He said them all directly at me slowly, the way you'd talk to a child or a dog. And within 4 minutes I understood the architecture of the evening. They spoke English at me, and French around me. That's what made it so elegant. It wasn't a wall, it was a rhythm. 10 minutes of English warm, polite questions about the drive the weather would. "I like more wine," and then Genevieve would say something low and quick to Mark, and the table would laugh, and someone would turn back to me and say, "Sorry, Eleanor, family joke," and keep going, over and over and over. "Oh, that's all right," I said, 20 times, 30 times. "Oh, that's all right, Tag." "You want to know what the family jokes were?" Mark asked Genevieve in French, whether I understood that the fish course was not the main course. Genevieve said she wasn't certain, and that they should watch and see. And they watched. 6 people at a table watched a 64-year-old woman eat a piece of fish to find out if she knew it wasn't dinner. Claudine said in French, She's very sweet, though, which is a sentence that means the same thing in every language on earth. And I picked up the correct fork. The correct fork, out of 4, because I spent 6 years in a kitchen in the Croix Rousse, learning exactly what every one of those forks is for, from a man who would have thrown Victor Laurent out of his restaurant by the collar for talking to a woman like that. I picked up the correct fork, and I ate my fish, and I said nothing. And Genevieve turned to Mark and said in French, "Tu vois, elle imite bien." You see, she imitates well. Let me tell you about Madame Bouchard, because I have to. Because if I don't tell you about her, then the rest of this is just a woman getting insulted at a dinner, and that's not what this is. 1985. I'm 23 years old. I've been in Lyon 11 days. I had $1,100, most of it from waitressing. My father repaired air conditioning units in Greensboro. My mother did books for a lumberyard. There was no program, no scholarship, no family friend with an apartment. There was a name and an address on a piece of paper from a girl I barely knew, and I could not read a street sign. 2 years of high school French from a woman who'd never left the state and pronounced croissant like it rhymed with tenant. Madame Bouchard ran the boarding house, 60-something, iron gray, and she spoke to me every single day for 2 years as though I already understood. She refused to slow down, absolutely refused. "Je ne comprends pas," I'd say. "I don't understand." "Vous comprendrez," you'll understand. "Madame, I don't." "Vous comprendrez." I hated her. I want to be honest, I hated that woman. I cried in a phone booth trying to call my mother and hung up before it connected because I couldn't afford the call, and I couldn't afford for her to hear my voice. I ate bread. I ate the ends of things. A landlord cheated me because I couldn't read a contract, and Madame Bouchard would not slow down. And then one Tuesday, month 14, I was standing in a bakery arguing about the price of a baguette. And I was 4 sentences in before I realized I wasn't translating anymore. I sat down on a bench outside that bakery, and I cried like a child. "Vous comprendrez." She was right. "So, Eleanor." Victor, refilling my glass without asking. "Nathan mentioned you'd traveled a bit when you were young." And there it was, the door, wide open. Nathan sat straight up, and his whole face changed, and he said, "Mom lived in France, right, Mom? Tell them." Every head at that table turned. And I need to tell you what happened in my chest, because the whole story turns on this, and if I lie to you here, then everything after it is worthless. I felt fear. Not embarrassment, not shyness. Fear. The real kind. The kind that gets into your hands. Because I could see it coming, all of it, the whole shape of it. I was going to say I lived in Lyon, and Genevieve's eyebrows were going to go up 1/2 inch, and she was going to say, "Oh, how nice." And then she was going to ask me one question in French, just one, to test me. And here's what I've never said out loud to anyone except Delia Rourke. I didn't think I could do it. 30 years. I hadn't spoken a word of it since a delivery room in 1996. It was all in my head, every word, all of it, I could hear it, but my mouth hadn't opened and let it out in 3 decades, and I sat at that table genuinely, sincerely believing that if I tried, nothing would come out. Or worse, something would come out and it would be wrong, slow, rusty, broken, and she would hear it, and she would be kind about it. God help me, that's what I was afraid of. I was not afraid of Genevieve Laurent being cruel to me. I was afraid of Genevieve Laurent being kind to me about my French, because if I opened my mouth and Eleanor wasn't in there anymore, if the last real thing I had turned out to be gone, then what was I? Then I was a bookkeeper from Marbury who took a nice vacation once. So I looked at my son, and I said, "Oh, a long time ago, just knocking around. You know how it is when you're young." Knocking around. 9 years. Madame Bouchard, the vegetable woman at Saint-Antoine. Gilbert handing me the spoon. Knocking around. Nathan blinked. "Mom, you were there like..." "It was a long time ago, honey." And Genevieve Laurent smiled at me and said, "How lovely. Everyone should see Paris once." I never said Paris. I said France. My son said France. She heard Paris because there was nowhere else in her head for a woman like me to have been. And I said it was beautiful. 2 words. It was beautiful. And Victor turned to Mark and said in French, 2 semaines à Paris, et elles rentrent toutes en croyant connaître le pays. 2 weeks in Paris, and they all come home thinking they know the country. And the table laughed, and my son laughed too, because he didn't understand a word. He just heard the sound of people at a table laughing and thought, good, it's going well. And he reached over. And he squeezed my hand under the table. He squeezed my hand. He was so proud that it was going well. Amélie put her glass down hard enough that it made a sound. Not loud, just a sound, a click on the wood. And she said in French to her father across the table, Papa, that's all, one word. Victor spread his hands. Quoi? And she looked at him for about 3 seconds. Then she picked her glass back up. And that was it. That's all she could do. Because her mother was watching, and her fiancé was smiling, and her father was comfortable. And there was no version of that moment where a 29-year-old girl wins. So she picked her glass back up. And I watched her do it, and I thought she's been doing that her whole life. And I hadn't defended her. Not once. Not one time in 3 years. I'd been so busy being polite that I never once thought about what it costs a girl to be the only person at a table who's ashamed. J'embarrassing. I excused myself. I said I needed the powder room, and Genevieve said, of course, down the hall, second door. And I walked out of that dining room past my apple pie sitting on a side table in a hallway, and I went in and I shut the door. And I put both hands on the edge of that sink, and I looked up. I'm going to tell you what I saw. And I'm going to be honest, because if I dress this up, I'm doing the exact thing to you that I did to my husband for 26 years. I saw a 64-year-old woman in a navy dress that was 9 years old, with her mother's chin and her father's hands standing in a bathroom the size of her own bedroom, hiding. And a voice came up out of me that I had not heard in a very long time. Qu'est-ce que tu fais? What are you doing? And I froze, because it wasn't in English. The thought came in French, unasked, uninvited, first try, no accent, no rust, no hesitation, no crack in it anywhere. Qu'est-ce que tu fais, Eleanor? She was in there. She had been in there the whole time. And I stood at that sink, and I started to shake, and it was not fear, and it was not sadness, and I'm going to tell you exactly what it was, because I'd been waiting 30 years to feel it, and I didn't even recognize it at first. It was rage, not at them, at me. Yeah. Because let me tell you about the flashcards. They put Nathan on my chest in 1996, and he was purple and furious and perfect, and I looked down at him, and it came out of me from somewhere underneath everything. Te voilà, je t'attendais. There you are, I've been waiting for you. And the nurse looked up and said, what was that, Hon? And I said, nothing, nothing. 30 seconds into my son's life, and I'd already started lying to him about who his mother was. I never spoke another word of it in that house. Not one. Not for 28 years. I could have raised that boy bilingual. It would have cost me nothing less than nothing. It would have been the easiest gift I ever gave him. And instead I raised him monolingual in a yellow house on Perkins Road, and when he was 9 and had to choose a language at school, he chose Spanish. And I said, that's great, honey. And I sat at my kitchen table with my son and helped him with Spanish flashcards. Uno, dos, tres. I sat there and drilled my child on a language I did not speak, while the one I bled for sat in my mouth like a stone. You want to know why I didn't tell the Lawrence start with the flashcards. Everything else is a detail. And Ray, I have to say this part because I owe it to him. Ray Whitmore was a good man. I loved him for 26 years, and I'd marry him again tomorrow. There is no villain in my marriage, and I won't let anyone make one. But Ray never asked. That's the whole thing. That's all of it. He knew I'd lived over in France for a while. That was his phrase. Lived over in France for a while, like a summer, like a semester abroad. And in the beginning, I'd start to tell him, and he'd smile, and he'd nod, and his eyes would go somewhere else. Not cruelly. He just didn't have anywhere to put it. It didn't fit in the life we were building. So it went in a box, and the box went on a shelf, and the shelf was in a room we stopped going into. And here's the part I have to say honestly, I let him. Nobody took it from me. There was no theft. I put it away myself, one small choice at a time, over about 4 years, because it was easier than being the woman at the church potluck who talks about France. You know that woman. Everybody knows that woman. Everybody makes fun of that woman. I was so afraid of being her that I became nobody instead. I turned the water on so nobody would hear me, and I looked at that woman in the mirror, 64 years old, 9-year-old dress hiding in a bathroom in a house with a name, and I heard Delia, "When's the last time you said her name out loud?" And I said it, out loud, in that bathroom, for the first time in 30 years. "Je m'appelle Eleanor." My voice cracked in the middle of it, so I said it again. "Je m'appelle Eleanor, et je suis toujours là." My name is Eleanor, and I'm still here. I turned the water off, I dried my hands, I fixed my face, and I walked back down that hallway past my pie toward the sound of them laughing. They didn't stop when I sat down. That's what I remember most. 30 years from now, when I've forgotten everything else, I'll remember that they didn't stop. They didn't lower their voices. They didn't glance up. Mark was mid-sentence, and he just kept going. Genevieve was leaning toward him with her wine. Victor was cutting his lamb. I sat down. I put my napkin in my lap. And Genevieve said, half-turned to her brother, not bothering to move her head. "Elle a l'air d'être une gentille femme, mais peut-être un peu trop simple pour notre famille. She seems like a nice woman, but perhaps a little too simple for our family." My hand stopped. Not dramatically, it just stopped, holding a fork over a plate. And Victor, still cutting his lamb, not looking up, in the voice of a man, remarking on traffic, "Nathan a réussi. Je me demande s'il réalise à quel point leurs milieux sont différents." Nathan's done well. I wonder if he realizes how different their backgrounds really are. And Mark laughed, and Claudine laughed, and Genevieve smiled into her glass, quietly, warmly, comfortably. And my son looked up from his plate, hopeful, smiling, 30 years old, still thinking rooms fix things, and said, "What's funny?" And Genevieve Laurent turned to my boy and said in English, in the warmest voice you have ever heard in your life, "Nothing, darling. We were just saying how happy we are that your mother came." And Amelie's chair moved, 2 inches. That's all. She started to stand, and her mother's hand came down on her wrist without Genevieve ever breaking eye contact with my son. And Amelie sat back down, and she looked at me. Across that table, 29 years old, with her mother's hand on her wrist and her whole face coming apart, she looked at me and mouthed one word, "Sorry." She apologized to me. She apologized to me. That girl had spent 29 years in that house, learning to sit back down, and the one night she almost stood up, she got stopped by a hand on her wrist, and then she apologized to me for it. And something in my chest went very, very quiet. Not the fear. The fear was gone. The fear had drained straight out of me, somewhere between the bathroom mirror and that chair, and what was left was quiet and clean and cold. I thought about Madame Bouchard refusing to slow down. I thought about Gilbert handing me the spoon. I thought about a girl of 23 who got on an airplane by herself with $1,100 and could not read a street sign, and who did not sit back down. Not once. Not in 9 years. Vous comprendrez. And I thought about my son's hand squeezing mine under the table because he was so proud it was going well. Victor set down his knife. He picked up the wine. He looked around the table with the easy, generous, comfortable warmth of a man who has never once in 66 years been wrong about anything in his own dining room. And he said in French to his wife, "J'espère seulement que nos petits-enfants hériteront de quelque chose d'un peu plus raffiné." I only hope our grandchildren inherit something a little more refined. And that sentence hung in the air over my son's head. Over my son's unborn children. And the table laughed. And Nathan laughed with them because he didn't know, Zag. 30 years. 30 years of, oh, that's all right. 30 years of Spanish flashcards and a shelf in a room I stopped going into and lived over in France for a while and knocking around, and it was beautiful. 2 words. That's what I gave 9 years of my life at that table. 2 words. And a girl across from me with a hand on her wrist mouthing, "Sorry." I looked down at my plate, and I heard her. Clear as the day I got off that plane. "Qu'est-ce que tu fais, Eleanor?" And for the first time in 30 years, I had an answer. "Rien, plus maintenant." Nothing. Not anymore. I set my fork down on the china. And the sound it made was very small, and everybody at that table heard it. It was 7:40 at night. I know that because there was a clock on the wall behind Victor's head, one of those old ones with the brass face, and I had been staring at it for most of the last hour the way a person stares at an exit sign. 7:40, Nobody moved. The fork was down, the sound had already happened, and the strange thing about a moment like that is how much room there is inside it. I had time. I had all the time in the world. I sat there with my hands in my lap, and I looked at Victor Laurent, who was still holding his wine, still comfortable, still finishing the last of his own laughter. And I opened my mouth, and she came out. Not carefully, not slowly, not the way I'd been afraid of all rust and cracks, and a woman fumbling for a word she used to own. She came out whole. Victor, faites attention quand vous jugez une femme dont vous n'avez jamais demandé l'histoire. Victor, be careful when you judge a woman whose story you have never once asked to hear. I want to tell you what that room did. Nothing. For about 2 full seconds, that room did absolutely nothing. Mark had a piece of lamb halfway to his mouth, and it stayed there. Claudine stopped chewing. Genevieve's glass was at her lips, and it did not move, not 1 inch, and I watched her eyes come up over the rim of it and find mine. And Victor's face did something I have thought about every day since. It didn't go red, it didn't go angry, it went young. For about a half second, that 66-year-old man looked exactly like a boy who has just been caught, and I understood something in that half second that took me the rest of the year to say out loud, which is that men like Victor Laurent are not confident. They're just unchallenged. Nobody at his table had ever turned around. Then he set his glass down. "You speak French," he said, in English. And I said, "Yes." "You speak French." "Victor," I said, "you've said that twice." Mark put his fork down. Claudine said very quietly in French, "Oh no, oh no." And that right there is the sound of a woman doing the math on her entire evening in real time. Nathan said, "Mom," and I couldn't look at him. That's the thing nobody understands about that moment. Everyone hears this story and they think the hard part was Victor. Victor was nothing. Victor was a man with a knife and a napkin. The hard part was that my son said, "Mom," in a voice I hadn't heard since he was 7 years old and lost me in a hardware store, and I could not look at him because I knew what was about to happen to his whole understanding of me, and I could not stop it. "Mom, what did you just say?" "Nathan, what did you say?" And Genevieve Laurent put her glass down, and she smiled. I want you to understand how fast this woman was. I have known a lot of people in my life, and I have never in 64 years watched anybody recover as fast as Genevieve Laurent recovered at that table. It took her maybe 4 seconds. 4 seconds to lose her footing, find it, and come back at me from a direction I did not see coming. She said, "Well," and then she said, "How long?" "How long what?" "How long have you been sitting at my table?" she said, listening. And there it was. That's the twist I never saw coming. I had spent the whole night braced for shame, for humiliation for her looking at my shoes. I had never once considered that the moment I opened my mouth, Genevieve Laurent would make herself the victim. "Since I got out of the car," I said. "Since you got out of the car?" "Yes. You've been in my home for 2 hours." "Yes. And you let us speak." And I said, "You didn't need my permission." Mark laughed, one short bark of a laugh, and then he stopped, because his sister looked at him. And I want to tell you that in that one look I saw 40 years of their childhood. Nathan's chair scraped. "Somebody tell me what's happening." Nobody did. That's the part that gets me. 6 people at that table, 4 of them fluent, and my son sat there in the middle of the biggest moment of his mother's life, and nobody would translate for him. So I did. I turned to my boy, and it was 7:44 at night, and I said, "Honey, about 20 minutes ago your future mother-in-law told her brother I seemed like a nice woman, but probably too simple for this family." Nathan's face didn't change. It just stopped. And a minute after that, I said, "Your future father-in-law said you'd done well for yourself, and he wondered whether you understood how different your backgrounds are." "Mom." And about 90 seconds ago, I said, "Victor said he hoped his grandchildren would inherit something more refined." And my son said, "Refined." That's the word. That's what he said. About our kids. That's what he said. And Nathan turned and looked at Victor Laurent, and I watched 30 years of my son's good manners go out of him like air out of a tire. "You laughed," he said. Victor said, "Nathan." "I laughed," Nathan said. "I laughed. I was sitting right here and I laughed at it. I squeezed my mother's hand under the table because I thought it was going well. And Victor said, it was a joke. And I said, it was in French. He looked at me. A joke, I said, is a thing you make in the room's language. What you did was a comment. There's a word for that in your language too, Victor. Une remarque. You know the difference. You've known it your whole life. That's why you switched. And Victor Laurent, who had not been contradicted in his own dining room in probably 20 years, said the thing I've been waiting to tell you about all night. He said, you should have told us. Let that sit. I should have told them. I'm sorry. You sat here, he said, and he was leaning forward now, and his voice was still perfectly pleasant, and that's the thing. That's the whole thing. His voice never once got ugly. You sat at my table for 2 hours, and you let my family speak freely in what we believed was a private conversation, and you said nothing. That's right. That's not honest, Eleanor. No, I said, it isn't. He blinked. I don't think he expected that. You're right, I said. It wasn't honest. It was the most dishonest thing I've ever done in my life, and I've had 20 minutes in your powder room to think about why, and I'm going to tell you because you asked. Genevieve said, Eleanor, I let you talk. I said because I have spent 30 years believing that being pleasant is the same thing as being good. Nobody said anything. 30 years, I said. I let my husband think I took a vacation once. I let my son learn Spanish. I have sat at every table I've ever been invited to and made myself as small as I could get because I was raised by a woman who believed the worst thing you can be is difficult. And I have never once in my life been difficult. Victor, and look what it bought me. And Victor said, what did it buy you? And I said, a seat at this table. It was 7:48. Claudine put her napkin on the table and did not pick it back up. Then Amelie stood, not the 2 inches, all the way, and her mother's hand went for her wrist again, and this time Amelie moved her arm before it got there. Non, she said. Non, maman, pas ce soir. No, not tonight. And Genevieve said in English brightly for my benefit, which was the single most insulting thing that happened all night, sit down, darling. And Amelie said, say it in French. Amelie, say it in French, maman. She understands. Say it in front of her. And Genevieve Laurent did not say another word in French for the rest of that evening. Think about that. 2 hours. 2 hours of that woman using her mother tongue like a knife under a table, and the second I could hear it, she put it down and never touched it again. She didn't switch to French because it was natural. She switched because it was safe. And the moment it stopped being safe, she abandoned the language of her own mother in her own house. That told me everything I needed to know about Genevieve Laurent, and it took her 4 seconds to tell me. Amelie, Victor said, sit down. Papa, I told you. I said don't do this. And the whole room went still again, because that is not a thing you say unless there was a plan. I said, what did you tell him not to do? And Amelie's mouth opened, and she looked at her father, and then she looked at Nathan, and she didn't answer me. Nathan said, Amelie, what did you tell him not to do? Nathan. What did you tell him not to do? And Victor said, nobody did anything. And Amelie said, Papa, she's sitting right there. It was 7:51. I have replayed that exchange more times than I want to admit, and here is what I understood at that table in about the space of one breath, and it went through me like ice water. They had not invited me to meet me. They had invited me to see me. 3 years. 3 years of no birthdays and no lunches and no Thanksgivings, and then one dinner 1 month before a wedding with the brother-in from Bordeaux and the wife and the good china and the 4 forks. That wasn't a welcome. That was a viewing. Victor, I said, why did you invite me here? Eleanor. 3 years, I said. I've been Nathan's mother for 30. She's been at my kitchen table a dozen times. She calls me about pie. And in 3 years, you never once picked up a telephone. We're busy people. You keep saying that, I said, and every time you say it, it means something else. And Genevieve said, that's enough. And I want to tell you what her voice did because it's the only time all night that woman let me hear the truth. It cracked. Not much. A hairline. One word enough, and the E came out about a half tone higher than the rest of her. And I heard it, and Mark heard it, and Amelie heard it, and every single person at that table who had known her longer than 2 hours heard it. Genevieve Laurent was not angry. She was frightened. And I sat there and I thought of what I'm a 64-year-old bookkeeper from Marbury, North Carolina, in a 9-year-old dress. What in God's name is this woman afraid of? Mark broke first. He said in French to nobody, "C'est un désastre." This is a disaster. And I said in French without even deciding to, "Marc, tu m'as demandé si je savais que le poisson n'était pas le plat principal." Mark, you asked whether I knew the fish wasn't the main course. He went gray. I mean it. That man's color left his face. "Tu m'as regardé manger," I said. "You watched me eat. Pendant 8 minutes, toi, ta femme et ta sœur. Vous m'avez regardé manger un poisson pour voir si j'allais me tromper." For 8 minutes. You, your wife, and your sister. You watched me eat a fish to see if I'd get it wrong. And Claudine said in a very small voice, "Madame, je suis..." "Ne faites pas ça," I said. "Don't do that. Pas maintenant. Ce n'est pas le moment de découvrir vos bonnes manières. Not now. This is not the moment to discover your manners." And Nathan said, "Mom, I can't understand any of this." And I said, "I know, honey. I know. I'm sorry. Give me 1 minute. Give me 1 minute. 30 years and I asked my son for 1 minute." Genevieve said, "Where did you learn it?" There it was. That's the question. That's the one she'd been circling since the second I opened my mouth, and it took her 11 minutes to get there, and when it came out, it did not sound like curiosity. It sounded like an accusation. "Where did you learn it?" she said again. "Lion." And she said, "That's not possible." I want you to hear that. Not how wonderful, not how long were you there, not what brought you. That's not possible. Why isn't it possible? And Genevieve Laurent said the sentence that told me exactly who she was, and she said it in front of her daughter and her husband and her brother and my son. She said, "Because you're a bookkeeper." It was 7:56, and Amélie said, "Maman," and Nathan stood up. He stood all the way up, and his chair went back about a foot. And I have known that boy since the second he existed, and I have never seen his face like that. Not at his father's funeral, not once. "Say that again," he said. "Nathan, sit down. Say that again about my mother." And Victor said, "Everyone needs to calm down." And I said, "Nathan, sit down, baby." And he said, "No." And I said, "Nathan Ray Whitmore, sit down in that chair." And he sat. 30 years old, 6'1", furious, and he sat. And I want to be honest with you about why I did that, because it wasn't kindness, and it wasn't peacekeeping. It was because that was my fight. For 30 years, I'd let other people carry me. Ray carried me. Nathan carried me. Delia carried me. Every single time somebody said something small about me, I let the nearest person handle it, and I sat there with my hands in my lap, being pleasant, and I was done. I was so done. "Genevieve," I said, "look at me." She looked at me. "You said it wasn't possible." I didn't mean, "You meant it exactly," I said. "You meant it the way you meant every single thing you've said tonight. So let's do it properly. You want to know if I'm lying? Ask me." "Eleanor, ask me." And Victor said quietly, "Genevieve, ask her." And she did. She sat up straight in her chair, and she folded her hands, and Genevieve Laurent asked me a question in French. And I want you to understand something about the question she chose, because it was not an accident, and it was not innocent, and I knew what she was doing the second the first 3 words were out of her mouth. She didn't ask me something conversational. She didn't ask about the weather in Lyon or how long I'd stayed. She used the subjunctive. She built a sentence with a conditional past subjunctive in it, which is a thing that native speakers use about as often as Americans use whom, and which is the single fastest way on earth to find out whether somebody learned a language or lived one. She asked me whether, had I truly spent so many years there, I might not have found it strange to say nothing about it for so long. It was a beautiful sentence. It was elegant, and it was surgical, and it was designed to break me. And I sat there, and I felt something I had not felt in 30 years. I felt fun. God forgive me. It was the worst night of my life. And I sat at that table, and something in me sat up and grinned, because Madame Bouchard did not slow down for 2 solid years, and I had eaten the subjunctive for breakfast in a boarding house in the 7th arrondissement of Lyon, when this woman was still in secondary school in Neuilly. So I answered her. And I put it back in the subjunctive. And then because I was 64 years old and I had waited 30 years, I did something small and unforgivable. I corrected her preposition. Very gently, the way you'd hand somebody back a dropped glove. Genevieve Laurent's mouth came open, and no sound came out of it, and Mark turned his face away from the table, and I saw his shoulders go, and I knew that man was going to remember this until the day he died. Victor said, "Good God," and Genevieve said, "That's not Parisian." It was 8 o'clock, and I'll be honest with you, I laughed, out loud. First real laugh I'd had all night. "No," I said, "it certainly is not. That accent is Croix-Rousse," I said. "Say it. Go on. You've been circling it for 4 seconds. That accent is working class, Genevieve. That's what you want to say. That's the whole thing you've been trying to say to me since I walked through your door, and you've said it 11 different ways tonight, and not one of them straight. So say it straight. One time. In front of your daughter." And she didn't. Of course she didn't. Because women like Genevieve Laurent never say it straight. That's the whole architecture. That's the entire building. If you say it straight, then you have to be a person who said it. And she had spent 61 years making sure she was never once a person who said it. She said, "I think you've misunderstood." And I said, "Sweetheart, I'm the only one here who understood anything." Nathan made a sound, half a laugh. He put his hand over his mouth. Victor said, "Where in the Croix-Rousse?" And that stopped me because his voice was different. That was the first sentence Victor Laurent said to me all night. That wasn't a performance. It came out lower and it came out faster, and there was something in it that had nothing to do with the room. "Why," I said, "you said Croix-Rousse. Where?" "Victor," Genevieve said, "where Eleanor?" And I looked at him, and I made a choice, and I'm still not sure it was the right one. I said, "I'm not going to talk about that with you." "Why not?" "Because you haven't earned it." It was 8:02, and Victor Laurent sat back in his chair like I'd put a hand on his chest. Amélie said, "Papa, what is it?" And he said, "Nothing." And she said, "Papa." And he said, "Nothing, Amélie." And he picked up his wine, and his hand was not steady, and every single person at that table saw it. I have thought about that for a long time. I'll tell you what I thought at the table, which was, he's embarrassed. He's a proud man, and I made him look small in his own house, and now he's rattled. That's what I thought. That was wrong. That was so wrong, it's almost funny now. But I didn't know that yet. At 8:02 on a Saturday night in April, I thought I'd won. Genevieve said, "I think we should all take a moment." And Nathan said, "No. Nathan, darling, don't call me darling." "Nathan, you called me darling 20 minutes ago," my son said, "when you lied to my face about what you'd said about my mother, so you don't get to call me darling." And Genevieve said, "I did not lie. You said you were happy she came. I am happy she—" "Do not." Nathan said, "Sit at this table and do that. Not with her right here, not with me right here." And then my son did something that I did not expect and that I have never fully recovered from. He turned to me and said, "Mom, how many times—" "What, tonight? How many times did they do it in French? How many?" And I said, "Nathan, don't." "How many, Mom?" And I said, "I don't know." And he said, "Yes, you do." And I did. God help me, I did. I'd been counting since the hallway. That's what a person does when they've decided not to understand. They count. 14, I said. The room went absolutely silent. 14 times, my son said. 14 that were about me. There were others. In 2 hours. Yes. And every time, Nathan said, "Somebody turned around and told me it was a family joke." Yes. And I said sorry. I said sorry to them, for you. He put both hands flat on that table. I said, "Sorry, Mom, they do that." I apologized to you on their behalf while they were doing it, 14 times. And I said, "Baby," and he said, "Don't," and I said, "Nathan," and my son said, "You let them." And there it was. That's the sentence. That's the one I'd been afraid of since the second I opened my mouth in French, and it did not come from Victor, and it did not come from Genevieve. It came from my boy, in a voice that wasn't even angry. It was worse than angry. It was hurt. "You sat here," he said, "and you let them talk about me, about our kids, and you didn't say anything. Nathan, you could have stopped it in the hallway, the first one. You said it yourself, you understood from the car." "Yes." "So why didn't you—" And it was 8:06 at night, and my son asked me why, and I sat at Victor Laurent's table in front of 6 people, and I told the truth for the second time in 30 years. I said, because I was afraid. Of them? No. Then what? And I said, of you. He said, what? I was afraid of you. I said, I was afraid of your face. Mom. I was afraid you'd look at me the way you're looking at me right now. I said, and you'd say, Mom, why didn't you ever tell me? And I'd have to answer it. And I have been afraid of that question for 28 years, Nathan, since the day they put you on my chest, and I have run from it every single day of your life. And I ran from it tonight too, and I ran from it at the exact moment you needed me not to. Nobody moved. So, no, I said. I didn't do it for them. I've never done a single thing for people like this in my life. I did it for me. I did it because if I opened my mouth, you'd find out that your mother was somebody else once, and that she gave it away for nothing, and that she wasn't brave, she was just quiet, and those aren't the same thing, and I never wanted you to know the difference. And my son sat there, and he said, Mom, that's the worst thing you've ever said to me. And I said, I know. It was 8:07. And then Amélie Laurent stood up for the second time that night, and this time nobody tried to stop her. She said, Nathan, come with me. Amélie, now, please. And Nathan looked at me, and I said, go on, honey. And they went out through the kitchen, and I heard the back door, and then it was me and Victor and Genevieve and Mark and Claudine and 5 people at a table with a lamb on it that nobody was ever going to eat. Claudine said, Je vais, and didn't finish and got up and left. Mark looked at his sister, and Mark said in French, Geneviève, tu vas t'excuser. Genevieve, you're going to apologize. And she said, toi, tu ne dis rien. You say nothing. And Mark said, j'ai ri, je sais ce que j'ai fait. I laughed. I know what I did. And he pushed his chair back and he stood up and he looked at me and he said in English, with all 40 of his English words at once, Madame, it was a bad thing. I am ashamed. And he left. And I'll tell you, of everybody at that table, that man is the only one who came out of that night with anything. So then it was 3 of us, Victor, Genevieve, me. And I sat there with my hands in my lap in a 9-year-old navy dress, and I thought about Madame Bouchard saying, vous comprendrez, and I thought about Gilbert handing me a spoon, and I thought about a girl who got off an airplane at 23 with $1,100, and I did not feel like her. I want to be honest about that. Everybody thinks that's the part where you feel like her. Everybody thinks that's the triumph. It wasn't. I felt sick. I had waited 30 years for that. 30 years. I'd rehearsed it. I'd dreamed it. I'd lain awake in a yellow house on Perkins Road and imagined saying something devastating to somebody who deserved it. And I finally did it, and I did it well, and I was good at it, and what I felt was my son's face on the other side of that kitchen door. Genevieve said, I'd like to say something. And I said, all right. And she said, you've ruined this. I'm sorry. My daughter's wedding is in 4 weeks, she said. 4, and you have made it about you. And I said, Genevieve. I said 1 sentence. You waited 2 hours to say it. I waited 30 years to say it. I said, and you happened to be sitting there. And she said, why did you come tonight? Because my son asked me to. That isn't why. Genevieve, you came here, she said, and she leaned in and her voice went down to almost nothing. Because you wanted to see it, the house, the name on the gate. You wanted to sit in this room and be looked at, and then you wanted to open your mouth and watch us all fall down, and you have been waiting all evening for it, and don't tell me you haven't because I saw your face when you picked up that fork. And you know what? She wasn't entirely wrong. That's the thing I have never told anybody. That's the thing that sat in my chest for weeks afterward. She was not entirely wrong, and the fact that she wasn't entirely wrong is the only reason her voice could still reach me. But I looked at her, and I said, Genevieve, I brought you a pie. Nothing. I stood in my kitchen at 6 in the morning, I said, and I peeled 9 apples for a woman who has never once said my name without checking the room first. That's not a woman lying in wait. That's a woman hoping. And I said, it's still in your hallway. And Genevieve Laurent's face came apart. Not much, not the way you'd want. Half a second right around the mouth, and then it was gone and she was made of marble again. But I saw it. Victor said, that's enough, Jenin. And she said, "Don't you?" And he said, "That's enough." And it was 8:14 at night, and Victor Laurent put both hands flat on the table and looked at me, and he said the thing that ended the evening, and I have never in my life been so completely unprepared for a sentence. He said, "Eleanor, do you know why we invited you here tonight?" And Genevieve said, "Victor." And he said, "She's going to find out." And Genevieve said, "Victor, don't." And he looked at his wife, and something passed between those two people that had 35 years in it, and then he turned back to me and he said, "It wasn't to meet you." It was 8:14 at night, and I sat in that chair and I heard the sentence, and the first thing I felt was not shock. I want to be honest about that. The first thing I felt was relief, because for 2 hours something had been wrong in that house in a way I couldn't put my finger on, and now a man had finally said a true thing out loud, and at least I knew the wrongness had a shape. "Then what was it?" I said. And Genevieve said, "Victor, I am asking you." And Victor said, "You've been asking me for 3 weeks, Genera. Look where it got us." "Victor." "She understood it all," he said. "Every word. What exactly are you protecting now?" And that shut her up. Not because he'd won, because he was right, and because Genevieve Laurent had spent the last 34 minutes doing arithmetic on which parts of the evening I'd been present for, and the answer was all of them, and there was no version of the night left where she got to choose what I knew. So she stopped talking, and she picked up her wine, and she drank it like medicine. "Eleanor," Victor said, "I'm going to be direct with you. That would be new." He almost smiled. I'll give him that. "We didn't invite you here to meet you," he said. "We invited you here to decide about you." And I said, "Decide what?" And he said, "Whether you'd be at the family table." It was 8:15. Tut. I want to tell you exactly what happened in my body, because it wasn't rage. I keep waiting for the part where I say it was rage. It wasn't. It was the sensation of a very old thing clicking into place. 3 years of no telephone calls, 1 dinner, 1 month out, the brother in from Bordeaux, the good china and the 4 forks and the fish that wasn't the main course. "Say the rest," I said. "Eleanor, you've started it. Say the rest of it, Victor. Mark didn't come for dinner, did he?" "Nothing." "Mark flew in from Bordeaux," I said, "for a Saturday, 4 weeks before a wedding, to eat lamb with a woman he's never met." "Nothing." "Mark came to vote," I said, and Victor Laurent looked at the tablecloth and he said, "Yes." And you know what I did? I laughed. I sat in that chair, and I laughed, and it came out of me ugly and short, and Genevieve flinched at the sound of it, which was the most satisfying thing that had happened to me since the fork. "How many votes?" I said. "Eleanor!" "How many Victor 3-5? Was Claudine voting? Or was Claudine just along?" "It wasn't. Was there a tally? It wasn't like that." "Then tell me what it was like," I said, "because I have been sitting at this table since 6 o'clock being watched, and I want to know the rules of the game I was playing, since I appear to have been the only person who didn't know we were playing one." And Genevieve set her glass down and said, "There were no rules. It was a dinner." And I said, "Genevieve, you served fish." She went very still. 4 forks, I said, "for 7 people. In your own home on a Saturday, family only. 4 forks and a fish course and a lamb, and your brother sat there and asked you in French whether I knew the fish wasn't the main." "That's not—" "You designed it," I said. "And here's the thing. Here is the thing I will never get over, not if I live to be 100. She didn't deny it. She looked at me across that table, and her chin came up about 1/4 of an inch, and Genevieve Laurent said, "It's not a crime to want to know who's coming into your family." And that right there is the most honest sentence that woman said all night. It was 8:17. "Who's coming into?" I said. "Genevieve, my son is marrying your daughter. Nobody's coming into anything. 2 kids are starting a thing that has nothing to do with either one of us." That's a very American way to look at it. It's a very adult way to look at it. You wouldn't understand. Try me. That's what tonight was for, wasn't it? Trying me. And the back door opened. I heard it from where I was sitting, and I heard footsteps come through that kitchen, and Amélie came in first with her arms crossed tight across her chest, and Nathan was behind her, and my son's eyes were red, 30 years old, red eyes. And Amélie looked at her father, and she said one word, "Alors." Well, and Victor said, "I told her." And Amélie's arms dropped. "You told her what?" All of it. Papa. She'd have worked it out by Tuesday, Amelie. She worked out Mark in about 4 seconds. And my son said, somebody's going to tell me, right now. Somebody in this room is going to say a complete sentence in English. And nobody did. So I did. I turned to my boy and I said, Nathan? They didn't invite me to meet me. They invited me here to find out whether I was good enough to sit at the family table at your wedding. It was 8:19. Nathan didn't move. Mark came from Bordeaux to help decide, I said. The menu was a test. The fish course was a test. That's why there are 4 forks on the table, honey. That's why your mother's been eating with an audience for 2 hours. And Nathan said, Amelie. And Amelie said, Nathan, Amelie, did you know? And that girl stood in her father's dining room with her whole family watching. And she said, yes. And my son's face. I've buried a husband. I want you to understand that I've stood at a graveside in the rain. And I would rather do it twice than watch my son's face do what it did in that half second. You knew. Nathan, listen to me. You knew, and you let her get in a car and drive 3 hours with a pie on her lap. I fought them for 2 weeks. You didn't tell me because I was trying to stop it. And Amelie was crying now, and she wasn't a bit quiet about it. And I want to say something about that girl that I've never said. She didn't defend herself well. She could have. She had every excuse in the world, and she didn't reach for one of them. She stood there and she took it, and she got about 4 words out for every 10 of Nathan's, and every single one of them was true, and none of them helped her. I told them no, she said. I told them no on the phone, and I told them no at Easter, and I told them no in this room 3 weeks ago, and my mother said, she stopped. Say it, I said. Eleanor de Amelie, say it. And Genevieve said, Amelie. And that was a mistake, because that girl had spent 29 years sitting back down when her mother said her name, and she'd sat back down once already tonight with a hand on her wrist, and something in her had finished. She reached in her back pocket, and she took out her phone. Amelie, Victor said, don't. You wanted it in English, she said. Fine, I'll do it in English. It was 8:22, and Genevieve Laurent stood up. That's the first time all night that woman got out of her chair, and I want you to remember that. 2 hours of insults, my son on his feet, a fork on the china, she sat through all of it like a queen at a parade. The phone got her up. Amelie, that is a private communication. You wrote it about his mother. It is a private. Then don't write things you can't read out loud. And Nathan said, what is it? And Amelie said, it's an email to Aunt Sylvie in Paris 3 weeks ago. And Genevieve said, give me the phone. And Amelie said, no. And Genevieve put her hand out, flat palm up the way you do to a child, and she held it there. And I watched 29 years of that girl's life happen in about a second and a half. And Amelie did not put the phone in her mother's hand. She read it. She read it in English, translating as she went in a voice that got flatter and flatter the further in she got, which is what happens to a person who is reading something they've already read 40 times in the dark. It said that the mother of the groom was an unknown quantity. It said that Nathan was a lovely boy from a modest situation. It said the seating for the family table was still open. And then it said, we'll see on Saturday. If she's what I'm afraid she is, we'll put her with the Hendersons and tell everyone she's unwell for the toasts. It was 8:24. Nobody said anything. I sat there in a 9-year-old navy dress with my hands in my lap, and I thought about 6 o'clock that morning standing at my counter in the dark, peeling 9 apples because Nathan said Genevieve wanted to know me, and I thought, well, I'd better bring something. We'll tell everyone she's unwell. They were going to tell 400 people that I was sick at my son's wedding, while I sat there, in the room, with a plate in front of me. Say it isn't real, Nathan said. Genevieve said it's out of context. Say it isn't real. And Genevieve Laurent said, you don't understand how these things, and my son picked up his glass and threw it. Not at anybody. Straight down into the middle of that table, and it went off like a shot. And there was wine everywhere, and Claudine screamed from somewhere in the hallway, and I did not move. I didn't move an inch. I sat there and I looked at Genevieve, and Genevieve looked at me, and it was the first time all night that woman held my eyes for more than a second. Nathan, Victor said. Nathan. And my son said in a voice I have never heard out of him, "Don't say my name in this house." It was 8:26. And then he turned to me and he said, "Mom, get your coat." And I said, "No." He said, "What?" And I said, "Sit down, Nathan." "Mom, sit down." And he stood there breathing, and he had wine on his shirt, and he was 30 years old, and he was 7 years old, and he was every age he'd ever been all at once. And I said it one more time, quiet. "Sit down, baby, I'm not finished." And he sat. And I turned to Genevieve Laurent and I said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to think before you answer it, because I've got a feeling this is the only chance either one of us will ever get." She said, "I'm not going to be interrogated in my own, 'Who said it about you?'" It was 8:28, and that woman's face went white. Not pale, white, like something got unplugged. "I'm sorry." "You heard me," I said. "You said it's not a crime to want to know who's coming into your family. You've said our family about 9 times tonight. You said the word simple about me before you'd known me 2 hours. And when your daughter stood up, you didn't grab her wrist because she was being rude. You grabbed her wrist because you were scared." "That's absurd." "Genevieve," I said, "I've been the quiet one at every table I've ever sat at for 30 years. Do you know what a quiet person does at a table?" She didn't answer. "She watches," I said. "So don't tell me what's absurd. Somebody in your life said it about you. Said it exactly like that. Said simple, or said something worse, and you were young, and you never got over it, and you have spent 40 years making very sure you'd be the one holding the knife the next time it came around." "Nothing. Am I wrong?" And Genevieve said, "You are a stranger in my house." And I said, "That's not a no." It was 8:30. And then Mark's voice came from the doorway, and I hadn't even heard him come back. He said in French very quietly, "Ils l'ont dit à propos de Victor." They said it about Victor. And the room stopped. Genevieve turned around so fast her chair went over. "Mark, tais-toi." Mark, shut your mouth. And Mark said, "Non." And Victor Laurent put his face in his hands. It was 8:31, and I was sitting at a table in Charleston, South Carolina, in a house with a name on the gate, and I watched a 66-year-old man put his face in his hands, and something started to come up through the floor of that room that had been down there for 40 years. "Mark," Victor said, "please." "Elle a le droit," Mark said. "She has the right." "Elle n'a aucun droit," Genevieve started. And I said, "Victor." He didn't look up. "Victor, where are you from?" And he said into his hands, "Lyon." And I said, "Where in Lyon?" It was 8:32. Nobody breathed. And Genevieve said, "Victor, don't you dare." And that's when I knew. That's the exact second. Not when Mark said it. When his wife said, "Don't you dare," in English in front of her daughter about the place her husband was born. 40 years of marriage, and she was still guarding the door. "Papa," Amelie said. He didn't answer. "Papa, what is he talking about?" And Victor Laurent took his hands off his face. And he looked at me. And he said something, and I have to explain what happened because I can't write it down in a way that shows you. He said, "La Croix-Rousse, Rue des Pierres Plantées, numéro 11. And it was not the same man's voice. The French he'd been speaking all night, the French he'd used to say my grandchildren should inherit something more refined, was a beautiful, cold Parisian instrument. It was bought. I knew it the first time he opened his mouth, and I hadn't let myself think about why. And what came out of him at 8:32 on that Saturday night was the Croix-Rousse. It was the hill. It was my hill. It was the way the men outside the Tabac talked. It was Gilbert screaming at me about my knife angle. It was the vegetable woman at St. Antoine making me say celery rave before she'd hand me the bag. It was flat and it was fast, and it swallowed the ends of the words, and I had not heard it in 31 years, and I sat in a chair in South Carolina, and my eyes went hot before my brain even caught up. And Amelie said, "What was that?" Her father's voice. She'd never heard her father's voice. 29 years old. It was 8:34. "Amelie," Genevieve said, "sit down." "Mama, what was that?" "Amelie. That wasn't Papa, that wasn't your..." And Victor said, "It's mine." And Genevieve said, "Victor." And Victor Laurent said, "It's mine. Jen, it's the only thing in this house that is." It was 8:35, and then he talked. He talked for a long time, and nobody interrupted him. Not once, not even his wife. And I'm going to give it to you the way he gave it to me. His father worked in the silk trade. Not the beautiful part, the printing end of it in a shop on the hill, and he was deaf in one ear by 50 from the machines. His mother worked. Everybody's mother worked. There were 4 kids in 2 rooms, and Victor was the one who was good at school, and in a family like that, being good at school isn't a gift. It's a job. He got out at 19, went to Paris Law. And he said, and I'm quoting him because I've had this sentence in my head every day since. He said, the first week a boy in my hall asked me to say chocolate. And Amélie said, what? He asked me to say chocolate, Victor said. And I said it, and he laughed, and he called 2 of his friends over, and he said, say it again. And he looked at his daughter. So I said it again, he said. And they laughed again. And I went back to my room, and I sat on the bed, and I decided that would never happen to me a second time. And it was 8:38, and the man who had said my grandchildren should inherit something more refined said, it took me 4 years. I did it with a radio and a tape recorder, 4 years every night until chocolate came out of me, the way it comes out of a boy from the 16th arrondissement. And then I met Genevieve. And Genevieve said, stop it. And he didn't. Her family asked what my father did, he said, and I said he was in textiles. Victor. Textiles, he said. I stood in a drawing room in Neuilly, and I said my father was in textiles, and Genevieve was standing right there, and she was 23 years old, and she heard me do it. And he turned to me, and she never said a word, he said. Not that night, not for 35 years. She has protected that lie longer than she's been a mother. It was 8:40, and Genevieve Laurent said in a voice I hadn't heard from her yet, I protected you. And Victor said, I know. They'd have eaten you alive. I know, Jen. My father would have. I know. And she sat down. She just sat down in the chair she'd knocked over and sat back up, and she put her hand over her mouth, and Genevieve Laurent, 61 years old, expensive as a knife, sat in her own dining room with her hand over her mouth and did not make a sound. And I'll tell you what I felt, and you're not going to like it. I felt sorry for her. Not forgiveness, don't misunderstand me. I have never forgiven what that woman wrote about telling 400 people I was unwell, and I'm not sure I'm going to. But I sat there and I looked at her and I finally understood the whole architecture of that house, and it wasn't cruelty. Cruelty would have been simpler. That woman had spent 35 years standing in front of a door with her arms out, keeping the world from finding out that she'd married a boy from the hill. And somewhere in about year 15, she stopped guarding the door and became it. You cannot spend that long defending a lie without turning into a person who needs everyone else to be lying too. And then a woman in a 9-year-old navy dress walks into your house with a homemade pie. And she's not lying, she's just quiet. And it terrified her. It was 8:43. Amélie, Victor said, I'm sorry. And Amélie said, sorry for what? Amélie, sorry for what, Papa? Be specific. Because I have spent my whole life being told that this family has standards. I have had that word in my ears since I was 6. I have watched my mother put people at the wrong table for 20 years. I brought Nathan here and I begged you, Amélie. And it was all about chocolate. And Victor Laurent said yes. And Amélie sat down on the floor. Not in a chair, on the floor with her back against the sideboard, and Nathan went to her, and my son got down on that floor next to her, and neither of them said anything for a while, and that's when I stopped being the guest of honor at that dinner and started being what I actually was, which was the woman who happened to walk into the middle of somebody else's 40-year-old disaster. And I sat there, and I thought about Ray. I thought about my husband, who said I'd lived over in France for a while, and who never asked, and who I never made ask. Victor and I did the exact same thing. He hid what he was ashamed of. I hid what I was proud of. And we both got the same result. 2 spouses who never knew us. 2 children who never knew us. 40 years of a voice that isn't yours coming out of your own mouth at your own table. The only difference between me and Victor Laurent is that he practiced. It was 8:47. Victor, I said. He looked up. Number 11 Rue des Pierres Plantées. Yes. That's 4 streets off the market. And his eyes changed. 3, he said. 3 if you cut through. And I said, there was a restaurant. And I want to tell you I hadn't finished the sentence. I had said the word restaurant and nothing else, and Victor Laurent said, Le Vieux Marché. It was 8:48, and I couldn't get any air. You know it, I said. Everybody knew it. Victor, you know it. And he said, I ate there twice in 19 years, twice, communion and my father's 60th. And I said, I worked there. And the whole room turned. You what? Nathan said from the floor. 6 years, I said, and I was not looking at my son. I was looking at Victor, and Victor was looking at me the way you look at a car coming. 1986 to 92. Chef was a man named Gilbert. He had a temper like a house fire. And Victor Laurent said, Gilbert Reynard. And I said, yes. And he said, Mon Dieu. It was 8:50. Mom, Nathan said. Mom, you worked in a... Not now, honey. You told them you were knocking around. Nathan, not now. And I leaned forward and I put both hands on Genevieve Laurent's ruined tablecloth and I said, Victor, what did your mother do? And Genevieve said, don't, instant, immediate, before he could take a breath. And I said, Genevieve, I'm not asking you. Eleanor, I am telling you. What did your mother do, Victor? And he didn't answer. It was 8:52, and a man who had talked for 15 straight minutes about the worst thing that ever happened to him stopped dead at a question about his mother. Victor. Eleanor. What did she do? It doesn't matter. It's the only thing tonight that does matter. And Amélie said from the floor in a small voice, Papa, what did Mamie do? And Victor Laurent said, don't call her that. And Amélie said, why not? It was 8:54. And here's where my hands started to shake, and I didn't know why yet. My body knew about 4 seconds before my head did. That happens sometimes. The body's faster. Victor, I said, say it. And Genevieve said, Victor, je t'en supplie. Victor, I'm begging you. And that man looked at his wife, and I have never seen anything like what was on his face. And he said, General, she was on the hill. She was on the hill, and she's been in this room all night, and I have sat here and let my brother-in-law watch her eat a fish. And Genevieve started to cry. And Victor Laurent turned to me, and it was 8:55 on a Saturday night in April, and he said, she cleaned it. I said, what? The restaurant, he said. The dining room, mornings before service, 19 years, and my hands stopped shaking because everything in me stopped. 19 years, I said, until she couldn't do the stairs. When? 94. 1994. I left in 94. I got the call about my mother, and I got on a plane, and I never went back. It was 8:58. Victor, I said, and my voice did something I didn't authorize. Victor, look at me. He looked at me. What was her name? Eleanor. What was her name? And Genevieve said, please, please don't. And Victor Laurent said, Colette. It was 9 o'clock at night, and I sat in that chair and the room went a long way away from me, and I was 28 years old in a hot kitchen at 6 in the morning in the Croix-Rousse, and there was a woman in a blue housecoat with a bucket, and she wouldn't let anybody help her with the chairs because she said we'd put them back wrong. And every single morning for 6 years, she came in and she looked at me and she said the same 4 words in that flat, fast hill accent that swallowed the ends. Alors l'américaine, debout. Well then, American girl, up you get. And I said out loud in Victor Laurent's dining room, Colette. And he said, your, and I said, blue coat. And Victor Laurent made a sound I am not going to try to describe to you. Wouldn't let anybody touch the chairs, I said, because we'd put them back wrong. Eleanor. 6 years, Victor. 6 years, 5 mornings a week. And he was out of his chair. He was standing, and he had a hand on the back of it, and he could not hold himself up straight, and Amélie was scrambling off that floor, saying, Papa, Papa, and Genevieve had both hands over her face, and my son was looking at me like he'd never seen me in his life. And I sat there, and I said the thing I'd been carrying for 31 years without ever knowing I was carrying it. I said, Victor, she talked about you. And Victor Laurent said, no, every day, no. She said her boy was a lawyer in Paris, I said. She said it to the fish man. She said it to me. She said it to anybody on that hill who'd stand still for 4 seconds. Colette from number 11 had a boy who was a lawyer in Paris, and she was so proud of you that it embarrassed people, Victor. It embarrassed people. That's how proud she was. And he said, stop. And I said, you never came back. And he said, stop. And Amélie Laurent stood in the middle of that room, 29 years old, with wine on the tablecloth and her mother crying and her father hanging onto a chair, and she said, who is Colette? Nobody answered her. Somebody answer me, she said. Who is Colette? And I looked at that girl, and I looked at Victor, and I said, Victor, does she know? And he didn't say anything. Victor, does your daughter know her grandmother's name? And Amélie said, my grandmother's dead. It was 9:02, and I turned and I looked at Victor Laurent, and Victor Laurent looked at the floor, and I said, is she... It was 9:02, and I had asked a man in his own dining room whether his mother was alive, and he did not answer me. That's the answer. You understand that. When a man doesn't answer that question, that is the answer, and everybody in that room heard it at the same time. And Amélie Laurent said, Papa. Nothing. Papa, look at me. And Victor said, Amélie, sit down. And she said, I've been sitting down my entire life. It was 9:03. And Genevieve took her hands off her face, and I watched that woman try one last time. I want you to appreciate this. 2.5 hours in the wine on the table, her brother in the doorway, her daughter standing there shaking, and Genevieve Laurent tried to manage it. She said, Amélie, your father's mother passed a long time ago, and this is not the... And Mark said from the doorway, Geneviève. And she stopped. She stopped because her brother said her name in that flat, tired, 68-year-old voice, and that was the second time that night Marc Aubertin took a hammer to his own family. And I want to say again that man is the only person in that house who came out of the evening with anything. Mark, I said, is Colette Laurent alive? And Mark looked at Victor, and Victor said nothing. And Mark said, oui. It was 9:04. Amélie made a sound. Not a word. A sound. And Nathan caught her, and my son held that girl up in the middle of her parents' dining room, and I sat in my chair with my hands in my lap because my legs would not have held me, and I said, how old? And Mark said, 91. Where? Villeurbanne, une maison de retraite, a nursing home in Villeurbanne. That's 15 minutes from the hill, 15 minutes. She got moved 15 minutes down the road, and she's been sitting there for God knows how long, and I sat in a dining room in South Carolina with a lamb going cold on the table. And I did the math, and the math was this. I left Lyon in 1994, and that woman was 59 years old, and climbing those stairs at 6 in the morning with a bucket, and she is 91 now, and I have been in a yellow house in Marbury, North Carolina for 31 years, and I never went back either. Neither did I. I want that on the record before I say another word about Victor Laurent. Neither did I. Papa, Amélie said. Papa, my grandmother is alive. And Victor said, it's complicated. And my son said, it's complicated. It was 9:06, and Nathan Whitmore, who had said maybe 40 words in the last 20 minutes, let go of Amélie and stepped forward, and I have never heard my child's voice come out like that. You told me she was dead. Nathan. At Easter, 2 years ago, in this room. I asked you about your parents, and you said, they're both gone. You said both. I remember it because I said I was sorry, and you said it was a long time ago. Nathan, sit down. You looked me in the face, and you said both. And Victor Laurent said, she is gone. And I said, Victor, she is gone, he said. And now it was loud, and it was the first loud thing out of him all night. She doesn't know what year it is. She doesn't know who's in the room. There's nothing there. Do you understand me? There is nothing there. And I said, when did you last go? Nothing. Victor, when did you last see her? And he said, I send money. It was 9:07. And I'm going to tell you what I did, and I'm not sure I'm proud of it. I stood up. For the first time since 6 o'clock that evening, I got out of that chair, and my knees were bad, and it took me a second and nobody helped me, and I stood at the end of Genevieve Laurent's table in a 9-year-old navy dress, and I said, answer the question. And Victor said, you have no... When did you last see Colette? And he said, 2011. 15 years. 15 years. Amélie said, Papa. And I said, does she have a photograph of your daughter? And Victor Laurent said, stop. Does she have a photograph of Amélie? Stop. Does that woman know she has a granddaughter? And Victor said, I don't know. It was 9:08, And that man sat down in his chair like his strings got cut. And Genevieve said, "Eleanor, that's enough." And I turned on her. I want you to know that I turned on her because for about 4 seconds I was not a nice woman. "You," I said. "Eleanor, you wrote an email about where to seat me. That has nothing to do. 3 weeks ago, you sat in this house and you wrote to your sister in Paris that if I turned out to be what you were afraid of, you'd tell 400 people I was unwell. Eleanor, I am asking you, and your husband's mother is in a home in Villeurbanne." And Genevieve Laurent said, "That is not the same thing." And I said, "No, it's worse. Because I'm a stranger, Genevieve. You were allowed to think I was nothing. But that woman put 4 children in 2 rooms and got one of them to Paris, and you've had her in a building 15 minutes off the hill for 15 years, and you didn't put her picture on a wall." And Genevieve said, "I have never once." And Victor said, "She's right." It was 9:10, and his wife turned and looked at him. "She's right, Jen. Victor, there isn't a photograph of my mother in this house." And Genevieve said, "Because you asked me." And Victor Laurent said, "I know what I asked you," and that's the sentence. Out of everything in that house, out of the whole night, that's the sentence that told me the truth about that marriage. He didn't say you kept her out. He didn't say you made me. He said, "I know what I asked you," and I watched 2 people who have been married for 35 years sit in a wrecked dining room and look at each other, and I understood that Genevieve Laurent had spent her whole adult life doing exactly what her husband asked her to do and got called the villain for it in her own daughter's eyes. I'm not defending her. I want to be very clear about that. That woman had a mean streak in her a mile wide, and it was hers. Nobody gave it to her. But she didn't build that door alone. He built it. She just kept it locked. It was 9/11, and Amélie said, "I want to see her." Genevieve said, "Amélie, I want to see my grandmother." "Amélie, she's 91 and she doesn't. I want to see my grandmother." And that girl screamed it. 29 years old in a family where nobody had raised their voice in probably a decade, and she screamed it, and the sound of it went through that house. And Claudine came out of wherever she'd been hiding and stood in the hallway with her hand on her chest. And Nathan said, "We'll go." And Amélie said, "Nathan, we'll go," my son said. "After, instead of Italy, we'll go." And Victor said, "You will not." It was 9:12. And Nathan turned around and said, "Excuse me, you will not go to Villeurbanne. With respect, sir, you will not go to my mother." And Nathan said, "Why?" And Victor Laurent said, "Because she'll ask about me." Nobody said anything. "She'll ask about me," he said, and his voice went to pieces on the second word. "And you'll have to tell her something, and whatever you tell her, one of 2 things happens. Either she believes it and it's a lie, or she doesn't and she knows." And Amélie said, "So go." Amélie, "So go, Papa. Get on a plane. Go tomorrow." It's been 15 years. "So it'll be 15 years and 1 day. And Victor said, "You don't understand." And I said, "I do." It was 9:14, and that room got quiet because I hadn't said a word in 4 minutes. "He's not staying away because he's ashamed of her," I said. Victor looked up. "Tell them," I said. "Eleanor, Victor, tell your daughter why you don't go." And he didn't, so I did. "He doesn't go," I said, "because if he stands in front of that woman, he has to open his mouth." And Victor Laurent put his hand over his eyes. "That's it," I said. "That's the whole thing. He's got 2 voices, and one of them cost him 4 years and a tape recorder, and the other one is his mother's, and he can't take the Paris one into that room. She'd hear it. 91 years old and half gone, and she'd hear it in 4 words because a mother hears it. So he'd have to walk in and be the boy from number 11, and he hasn't been that boy since he was 19, and he doesn't know if that boy's still in there." And I said, "And if he goes and finds out he's not?" And I stopped, because my throat closed. Because I was in a bathroom 4 hours ago with my hands on a sink, terrified to open my mouth in French in front of a woman I'd known for 90 minutes for exactly, precisely, identically the same reason. "Then what's he been carrying?" I said. "For 40 years, for nothing." And Victor Laurent said into his hand, "Yes." It was 9:16, and my son said, "Mom." And I said, "Yeah, honey." And Nathan said, "That's you." And I said, "I know. That's exactly you. That's what you did tonight. You sat right there and you— Nathan, I know. And he said, Mom, you knew and you did it anyway. And I said yes, and my son said, why? And it was 9:17 at night, and I stood at the end of that table and I told my child the truth. Because I'd rather you thought I was nothing, I said, than find out I used to be somebody and threw it away. And Nathan said, that's the same thing. And I said, no, it isn't. And he said, Mom, it's the same thing. You threw it away either way. The only difference is I didn't get to know you. It was 9:18, and I sat back down. I sat down because that boy put it through me like a nail, and because he was right, and because for 30 years I'd had a story about myself that said I was protecting somebody, and my son stood in a stranger's dining room and took it apart in 11 words. The only difference is I didn't get to know you. Genevieve said very quietly, Eleanor, I'd like to say something to you. And I said, all right. And it was 9:19, and Genevieve Laurent said, I've written that email 4 times. I didn't understand. I'm sorry. In 22 years, she said, about my daughter's teacher, about Mark's first wife, about a boy Amelie brought home when she was 19, and about you. And she looked at her hands. I've never once been wrong, she said. And I said, Genevieve, I've never once been wrong, she said, and I have been so proud of that. Do you understand what I'm telling you? It's not that I'm cruel. I've been right. Every time. For 22 years, I have been able to look at a person for 90 seconds and tell you exactly what they were, and I have never been wrong, and it has made me— And she stopped, and I said, say it. And Genevieve Laurent said, it has made me somebody I don't want my daughter to be. And Amelie said, Maman. And Genevieve said, don't. It was 9:21. I looked at you in that hallway, she said, and I had it in 4 seconds. 9-year-old dress, homemade pie, bookkeeper, Marbury, widow. I had the whole thing. I had the entire woman in 4 seconds, and I was so certain of it that I said it out loud in my own language in front of my brother, and I have been doing that for 40 years, and I have never been wrong. And she looked up at me, and she said, and I have never been so wrong in my life. And you know what? I didn't feel a thing. I want to be honest with you, because this is where the story is supposed to turn, and everybody who hears this expects me to say that something warm came up in my chest. Nothing came up. I sat there and I looked at that woman and I thought, you're not sorry you hurt me. You're sorry you missed. And I said it. I said, Genevieve, you're not apologizing. I am. You're not. You're grieving your record. And she went white for the second time that night. You just told me you have been right 4 times out of 4, I said, and you're upset because it's 4 out of 5. That's not an apology, sweetheart. That's a batting average. It was 9:23, and Mark laughed. He couldn't help it. He put his hand over his mouth, and it came out anyway, and Genevieve turned around and looked at her brother, and Mark said, pardon, mais elle a raison. Sorry. But she's right. And Genevieve Laurent said, tais-toi, Mark. And Mark said, non. And that man came all the way into the room for the first time since he walked out of it, and he pulled out a chair, and he sat down at the head of a ruined table across from his sister, and he said in English slowly, with every one of his 40 words, Geneviève, when you are 11, the girls at school. And Genevieve said, Mark, don't you dare. And Mark said, they call you la fille du boucher, the butcher's daughter. It was 9:25, and the whole room stopped. And Genevieve Laurent said, my father was in meat distribution. And Mark said, Papa was a butcher. He was in distribution. He was a butcher. Geneviève and Maman did the books, and we lived over the shop until you were 14 years old, and you have not said the word butcher out loud since 1978. And she said, get out of my house. And Mark said, it's not your house. It's his house. It's the house of the boy from the hill you married, so nobody would ever ask you what Papa did again. It was 9:26, and I sat there. And I want to tell you what I felt, and it was not triumph. God as my witness, it was not triumph. It was the floor going out. Because I finally saw it, the whole thing, the entire architecture of that dining room, and it took me until 9:26 at night on a Saturday in April to see it, and it made me want to lie down. 2 children. 2 poor children from 2 different corners of France, one from a hill and one from over a butcher shop, and they found each other at 23 and 25, and they made a deal. They didn't say it out loud. People never say it out loud. But they made a deal that neither one would ever ask the other one where they came from, and they'd build a house with a name on the gate, and they'd fill it with paintings and forks, and they'd have a daughter and raise her in a language they'd both had to buy. And it worked. It worked for 35 years. And then a bookkeeper from Marbury, North Carolina, walked in with a pie. And I didn't have a name on a gate, and I didn't have 4 forks, and I had a dress from 9 years ago, and I had 9 years in Lyon that I never once mentioned, that I never once used, that I never once traded on. I was the one thing in the world those two people could not survive. I was proof you could have it and not need it. "Oh," I said, out loud, just "oh." And Genevieve looked at me, and I said, "It was never about whether I was good enough." She didn't answer. "You didn't invite me here to find out if I was good enough for your table," I said. "You invited me here to find out if I was safe." Nothing. "You were afraid I'd be somebody who'd walk into that wedding and start talking about where I came from in front of 400 people at a microphone, and your whole family would be sitting there. Aunt Sylvie, Mark, all of Neuilly." And I said, "And somebody might have asked Victor a question." It was 9:28, and Genevieve Laurent said, "Yes." And there it was, 2.5 hours and 1 word. Yes. "That's all of it," I said. And she said yes. And I said, "You'd have put a 64-year-old woman at a table with strangers at her own son's wedding and told the whole room she was sick so that nobody would ask your husband about his mother." And Genevieve Laurent said, "Yes." And Amélie said, "Maman, oh my God." And Genevieve said, "You don't know what it's like." And Amélie said, "I don't know what it's like. I'm your daughter. I have been your daughter for 29 years, and I have never once been allowed to be anything but finished. Do you know what that's like? Every dress, every school, every friend, every maman. I was 7 years old, and you sent Mathilde Perrin home from my birthday party because of her shoes." And Genevieve said, "That's not true. You told me she had a stomachache." Amélie, "I found out when I was 22. She told me, at a bar. She thought it was funny. She thought it was a funny story, and I laughed. Maman, I laughed, and then I went to the bathroom, and that girl couldn't finish it. And it was 9:30 at night, and Amélie Laurent stood in that room and could not finish a sentence about a 7-year-old's birthday party 22 years ago. And Nathan put his arms around her. And Genevieve said, "I did it for you." And Amélie said, "You did it to me." It was 9:31. And here's where the night turned, and it did not turn the way you'd think, and it did not turn because anybody apologized. It turned because of the pie. Mark got up. Nobody asked him to. He got up and he walked out into the hallway, and I heard him stop. And then I heard him come back, and Mark Aubertin walked into that dining room carrying my apple pie in both hands like a man carrying something at a funeral. And he set it down in the middle of that table, in the wine, right in the middle of it. And he said in English, "Madame, please." And I said, "Mark?" And he said, "S'il vous plaît." I asked, "Please, I would like..." And he ran out of words. He stood there and he ran out of English right in the middle of it, and he looked at me and he said the rest in French, because that's all he had. He said, "Madame, j'ai ri à table. Je n'oublierai pas. Je vais y penser longtemps. Alors, s'il vous plaît, laissez-moi manger votre tarte." Madame, I laughed at that table. I won't forget it. I'm going to think about it for a long time. So please, let me eat your pie. It was 9:33, and I have thought about that moment probably 1,000 times since, because that's what an apology is. Not "I'm sorry," not "I've never been so wrong in my life," not a speech, a 68-year-old man standing in front of a ruined table asking a woman if he can please eat the thing she made at 6 o'clock in the morning. And I said yes, and Mark said, "Merci." And Genevieve said, "There aren't any plates." And Mark said, "Alors," and that man reached into that pie with his hands, in a dining room in Charleston. Genevieve made a sound like she'd been shot, and Mark Aubertin ate a handful of my apple pie standing up, and then he closed his eyes. And he stayed like that for about 3 seconds. And then he said in French quietly, mostly to himself, "Ah, elle a égoutté les pommes." She drained the apples, and I laughed. It came up out of me from somewhere underneath everything, and once it started, I could not stop it. And I sat in that chair with my hands over my face, laughing like a lunatic. And Nathan started laughing. And then Amelie and I want you to understand, nothing was okay. Nothing in that room was okay. That family was in pieces. And my son's wedding was in 4 weeks, and I had cried in a bathroom 2 hours before. And a man was eating a pie with his hands. And it was 9:35, and for about 40 seconds, 5 people who had done terrible things to each other laughed in a room together. And then Victor Laurent said, "I'd like some." And it stopped. It was 9:36. And Genevieve said, "Victor." And he stood up, and he came around that table. And Victor Laurent, 66 years old, international shipping law, a house with a name on the gate, put his hand into my pie and ate it standing over the wreck of his own dinner table. And I watched his face. And I want to tell you what I saw, and I'll be careful because I've told this part badly before. He wasn't tasting the pie, he was trying to find something in it. He stood there with his eyes shut, and he was going through that pie like a man going through a drawer, and I understood exactly what he was doing because I have done it. I did it in a bakery in 1999 in Greensboro with a bad croissant, and I stood in the parking lot afterward and cried for 20 minutes. He was looking for the hill, and he wasn't going to find it in an American apple pie made by a woman from North Carolina, and he knew that, and he did it anyway. And he said, "It's very good." And I said, "Victor." And he opened his eyes. And I said, "Tu ne le trouveras pas là-dedans." You won't find it in there. And Victor Laurent said, "Je sais." I know, it was 9:38, and then he said the thing. He put his hands on the back of an empty chair, and he looked at the table, and he said, "She made bougnes." And Amelie said, "What?" "My mother," he said, "at Carnival. Bugnas, every year. The whole flat smelled of it for 3 days, and you couldn't get the smell out of your coat." And Amelie said, "Papa." And Victor Laurent said, "I haven't said that word in 40 years. And his daughter said, "You've never said any of this." And he said, "I know." And she said, "Papa, I don't know one single thing about you." It was 9:40, and Victor said, "There's nothing to know." And Amelie said, Don't you dare do that. Don't do the thing where you make it small, so I'll stop asking." And he said, "Amelie." And she said, "That's what she did." And she pointed at me. And it went through me like a spike, and I looked at that girl, and she was pointing at me, and she said, "That's what Eleanor did all night?" She made it small so nobody would ask. She said, knocking around. She said it was beautiful. And you have all been doing it my whole life, and I thought it was me. I thought I was the crazy one. I thought I was the only person in this family who couldn't. And she stopped. And she said in a completely different voice, "I don't want to get married." It was 9:42, and my son said, "What?" And Amelie said, "Nathan." And Nathan said, "What did you just say?" And she said, not like this. Not Nathan. Nathan, look at me. Not you, not you. I mean, I don't want to walk into a room with 400 people in it and stand up in front of them and be the last person in this family who does it. I don't want to do the thing. I don't want to be finished. I don't want to look out at that room and know that 3 of the people at the head table are pretending, and my grandmother is alive in Villeurbanne, and my mother's got a seating chart with a plan on it. And Genevieve said, "Amelie, the invitations went out." And Amelie Laurent said, "Maman." And Genevieve said, "The invitations went out, Amelie." It was 9:44, and I stood up, second time that night, and I said, "Genevieve, look at your daughter." And she said, "Eleanor, this doesn't." And I said, "Look at your daughter." And she did. And I said, "That girl just told you she doesn't want to get married, and the first thing out of your mouth was the male." And Genevieve Laurent opened her mouth, and nothing came out. And I said, "That's it. That's the whole thing. That's 40 years in one sentence." And she sat down, and she said, "I don't know how to do this." And I said, "I know. I don't know how to Eleanor. I don't know how to talk to her without." And I said, "I know Genevieve." And she said, "How do you?" And she couldn't finish it. And I said, "I don't." It was 9:46. "I don't know either," I said. "I've got one child. One. I've had him for 30 years, and he found out tonight at somebody else's table in front of strangers that his mother had an entire life. I'm not standing here because I figured it out. I'm standing here because I didn't, and I got to watch what it cost, and it cost the exact same thing yours did." And Nathan said, "Mom." And I said, "It's true, honey." And I looked at Victor. And I said, "Victor, I'm going to say one thing, and then I'm going to sit down." And he said, "Yes." And it was 9:47 at night, and I said, "She's 91. And Victor Laurent said, "Eleanor." That's all, I said. That's the whole thing. She's 91. Whatever the number is that you're waiting for, whatever it is you think you have to be or fix or become before you can walk in that door. She's 91 and you're not going to get there and you're going to get a phone call instead. And he said, you don't know that. And I said, Victor, I got the phone call. It was 9:48. And the room went absolutely still, and I heard my own voice go, and I could not stop it. 1994, I said, my mother. And I got on a plane, and I came home for 6 weeks, and I want you to understand something I did not know that was the last time I'd see Lion. Nobody tells you. There's no announcement. I packed for 6 weeks. I left everything in that room, my books, my coat. There was a photograph of the kitchen staff on my wall, all of us, Gilbert in the middle with his arms crossed. And my voice went, and I stood there in front of 6 people, and I had to stop and get it back. I left it on the wall, I said, because I was coming back in 6 weeks. And I said, Victor, I never went back. And your mother cleaned that dining room for another 14 years, and I never wrote her one letter, not one, because I thought I was coming back. And it was 9:50 at night, and I said, so don't sit there and tell me I don't understand why you don't go. And Victor Laurent looked at me, and he said, Elle demandait de vos nouvelles. She used to ask about you, and I said, what? And he said, l'américaine, elle m'en parlait au téléphone, pendant des années. The American girl. She used to talk to me about her on the telephone, for years. It was 9:51, and I could not breathe. You knew, I said. No, you knew about me. Eleanor, no, not you. There was a girl at the restaurant, an American. That's all it ever was. For 20 years, my mother told me about an American girl at Le Vieux Marché who could do the sauces and who left. And he said, Elle disait que vous étiez parti sans dire au revoir. She said you left without saying goodbye. And it was 9:52, and I sat down in a chair in Charleston, South Carolina, and I put my face in my hands and I cried the way I had not cried at my own husband's funeral. Because I did. I did leave without saying goodbye. I got a phone call at 11 o'clock at night, and I was on a plane in 9 hours, and I never told her. I never told anyone. I told Gilbert on the phone for 90 seconds from an airport. And a woman in a blue housecoat came up those stairs the next morning at 6 o'clock with a bucket and said, Alors l'Américaine debout, and nobody was there. And she asked about me for 20 years. And it was 9:54 at night, and Victor Laurent stood over me and said the sentence that finished the evening. He said, Eleanor, if I get on a plane. And I looked up. And he said, will you come with me? It was 9:54 at night, and I said no. I want to be honest with you about that because everybody who hears this story wants that moment to be beautiful. They want me to look up with wet eyes and say yes, and then we all get on a plane. I said no, and Victor Laurent said, Eleanor. And I said, no, Victor, sit down. I'm asking you. I know what you're asking me, and the answer is no, and I'll tell you why in about 4 seconds, but first I want you to hear yourself. And he stood there. You just asked a woman you met at 6 o'clock tonight to hold your hand while you go see your own mother. Nothing. You've had a wife for 35 years, I said. She's sitting right there. You've had a daughter for 29 and she's standing behind you. And your brother-in-law is at the head of the table with pie on his hands. And you looked around this room and picked me. And Victor said, because you knew her. And I said, that's not why. And he said, then why? And it was 9:56, and I said, because I'm the only person in this room you haven't lied to yet. And Victor Laurent sat down. You want to take me, I said, because I'm outside. Because I can walk into that room with you and watch you be the boy from number 11, and it won't cost you anything, because I'm going to get on a plane and go back to Marbury, and you'll never have to see me again. That's not courage, Victor. That's a witness you can throw away. And Genevieve said quietly, she's right. And Victor said, Jen. And Genevieve Laurent said, Victor, she's right, and I want you to take me. It was 9:57, and that man turned around and looked at his wife like she'd spoken Greek. You've never asked to go, he said. You've never gone. You've never. Victor, she said, in 35 years you have never once asked me to come with you, and in 35 years I never once asked to. And I would like somebody in this room to explain to me which one of those is worse, because I have been sitting here for 2 hours trying to work it out, and I can't. And Amélie said, Mama. And Genevieve said, Don't. Don't be kind to me right now, Amélie. I can't hold it. It was 9:58. And Mark said in French from the head of the table with his hands still sticky, Gilbert Reynard est mort en 2019. Gilbert Reynard died in 2019, and the room stopped. And I said, "What?" And Mark looked at me and he said it again in English, all 4 words. "The chef, he die." And I said, "How do you know that?" And Mark said, "Je mange à Lyon 4 fois par an, madame. Tout le monde le savait. Il y avait une notice dans le journal." I eat in Lyon 4 times a year, madame. Everyone knew. There was a notice in the paper. It was 9:59 at night, and I sat in that chair and I did the math again. And the math is the thing that will kill you. 2019. I was 57 years old in 2019. My husband was alive. I was working. I had a passport in a drawer in my bedroom that expired in 2016, and I never renewed it because why would I? And Gilbert Reynard was in a bed somewhere on that hill, and he was 79, and I never wrote him 1 letter either. And I said out loud, I never wrote anybody. And Nathan said, Mom. And I said, nobody. 25 years, not 1 letter. I let all of them think I just evaporated. And Delia Rourke's voice came up out of the floor at me from a phone call 10 days before in the dark on the edge of my bed. When's the last time you said her name out loud? And I understood something at 9:59 at night in a stranger's dining room that I had not understood in 31 years. I hadn't left France. I'd left Eleanor there. I'd left her standing on a hill in a kitchen in a blue apron with a photograph on the wall, and I flew home and I got a job and I married a man and I raised a boy, and every year I told myself the same lie, which was that she was gone, that she'd faded, that time took her. Time didn't take anything. I abandoned her, and she waited. 31 years in a room with a coat and some books and a photograph of a kitchen staff, and she waited. And every single morning at 6 o'clock, a woman in a blue housecoat came up those stairs and said, Alors, l'Américain debout. And I wasn't there. And I said, oh God. It was 10 o'clock at night, and my son got out of his chair and came around that table and knelt down next to me, 30 years old, on the floor in wine, and he took both my hands. And he said, Mom, listen to me. And I said, Nathan, I can't. Mom, look at me. When's the flight? What? When's the flight? My son said. Because you're going. And I said, honey, I don't have a passport. And Nathan Whitmore said, then we'll get you a passport. It was 10:01, and I laughed. It came out of me broken. Nathan, it takes 6 to 8 weeks, 4 if you pay, 2 if you go in person to Atlanta with an appointment and a plane ticket in your hand. And I looked it up in the car. And I stopped. You looked it up in the car. And my son said, 3 hours down here, Mom. You held a pie the whole way, and you wouldn't talk to me. So yeah, I looked it up. And I said, why? And Nathan said, because you said knocking around to a table full of people, and I've been sitting here for 4 hours realizing I've never met you. It was 10:02, and I said, Nathan. And he said, no, my turn, I get one. And he was still on his knees, and he still had both my hands, and my son said, when I was 9, I picked Spanish. And I said, baby. I picked Spanish, he said, because I asked you what I should take, and you said take whatever you like, honey, and then you went and did the dishes. Nathan. And I sat at that table with those flashcards for 2 years, Mom. 1, 2, 3. And you drilled me every night, and you never... And he had to stop, and it was 10:03, and Nathan Whitmore put his forehead down on my hands, and my 30-year-old son said, Mom, you'd have been so good at it. And that's the one. Out of everything in that whole house, out of Victor and the email and the fish and the 4 forks, that's the sentence that took me apart. Not how could you? You'd have been so good at it. Because he wasn't angry. He'd gone past angry an hour ago. My boy was grieving at somebody else's dinner table for a mother he'd been sitting next to for 30 years. And I said, I know. And he said, you'd have been so good at it. And I said, I know, baby. And Genevieve Laurent said, take her. It was 10:04, and we all looked at her. Take her to Atlanta, she said. Monday, I'll make the call. My cousin's husband is at the consulate in... And she stopped herself. And she said, no, I'm doing it again. And Amelie said, Maman, what? That's what I do, Genevieve said. Somebody has a problem, and I reach for the name. I've done it her whole life. Somebody's in trouble, and I don't ask them anything. I just make a call, and then they owe me, and then I'm the one who... And she put her hand flat on that table, and she said, "Eleanor, would you like help getting a passport? I'm asking. That's all. It's a question." And I sat there, and it was 10:05 at night, and I want you to understand that I had spent 30 years never asking anybody for anything, because asking is difficult, and I was never difficult, and that woman had insulted me in 2 languages for 2 hours. And I said, yes, I would. And that's the moment I stopped being small. Not the fork, not the French, not the subjunctive. Yes, I would. And Genevieve Laurent said, all right. And that's all. She didn't make it a scene. She didn't make it a favor. She said, all right, and she got a pen out of a drawer and she wrote something on the back of a place card and she pushed it across the table into the wine, and that is the first and only kind thing that woman did all night, and I have kept that place card. It's in a drawer in my kitchen in Marbury. It's got a wine ring on it. It was 10:07. And Amélie said, I want to say something and I want to say it now because if I don't say it tonight, I'll never say it. And Genevieve said, Amélie. And Amélie said, Maman, I'm not asking. And she stood in the middle of that room with her arms at her sides, and she said, we're getting married. And Nathan looked up off the floor. We're getting married, she said. In 4 weeks, and the invitations went out, and 400 people are coming, and I am not calling a single one of them. And Nathan said, Amélie. But here's what happens, she said. The head table. Eleanor sits at the head table, not with the Hendersons, not sick. Head table maman, and if you have to move Sylvie, then you move Sylvie, and if Sylvie asks why, you tell her the truth. And Genevieve said, and what's the truth? And Amélie Laurent said that my mother-in-law lived in France for 9 years and worked in a restaurant in the Croix-Rousse and speaks better French than you do. It was 10:09, and Genevieve went white for the 3rd time, and she said, Amélie, Sylvie will. I don't care what Sylvie will. You don't understand what she'll. I don't care what Sylvie will, maman. And it hung there. And then Amélie said quieter, and there's one more. And Victor said, Amélie. And she said, Papa, there's one more, and you know what it is. And he said, Amélie, please. And Amélie Laurent said, I want Mamie's picture at that wedding. It was 10:11, and that room went so quiet I could hear the clock. There's a table at every wedding, she said. You know the table, the little one with the frames on it, for the people who couldn't come. And Victor said, she's not dead, Amélie. And Amélie said, I know she's not dead. And she was crying now, and she didn't stop for it. That's the point, she said. That's the whole point, Papa. It's not a memorial table. It's a table for the people we love who can't be in the room, and she can't be in the room. And I love her, and I have never met her, and I don't know what she looks like, and I want a photograph of my grandmother on a table at my wedding, and I want it right there where 400 people can see it, and if somebody asks who she is, and she looked at her father, and she said, then you tell them. It was 10:12, and Victor Laurent said, I don't have a photograph. And Amélie said, what? And he said, I don't have one. And Amélie said, you don't have a photograph of your mother. And Victor said, no. And Genevieve said, Victor. And he said, I don't. Jen, I've looked. I looked when we moved. There's nothing. And it was 10:13 at night, and I said, I do. And the whole room turned. And I said, not of her face. And Victor said, Eleanor. And I said, Victor, listen to me. In 1992, Gilbert had a photograph taken of the whole staff. All of us. Front of the house, back of the house, everybody. He made everybody come in on a Monday. And I had a copy of it on my wall in that room. And Victor said, you left it. And I said, yes. And he said, then. And I said, Gilbert had the original. It was 10:14, and Marc Aubertin stood up. And he said in French fast, Renard avait un fils. Il a repris le restaurant. Il l'a vendu en 2022, mais je connais l'acheteur. Renard had a son. He took over the restaurant. He sold it in 2022, but I know the buyer. And I said, Marc. And he said, Madame, laissez-moi faire ça. Madame, let me do this. And I said, why? And Marc Aubertin, 68 years old, standing at the head of his sister's ruined table with apple pie on his hands, said the last thing he said to me that night. He said in French, parce que j'ai ri. Because I laughed. It was 10:15 at night, and I'm going to tell you what happened, and I'm going to tell you fast because that's how it happened. Mark found it in 9 days. 9 days. He called the buyer called Reynard's son in Vienne, and Reynard's son had a box. Not one photograph. A box. 19 years of a man who screamed at everybody and threw nothing away. And on the 14th of May, an envelope came to a yellow house on Perkins Road in Marbury, North Carolina. And I sat down at my kitchen table and I opened it. And there we were. 22 of us in front of that restaurant on a Monday in 1992. Gilbert dead center with his arms crossed and a face like a thunderstorm. And I'm 3 from the left, 30 years old, with my hair up, and I look, and I have to tell you this, I look hard. I look like a woman who could do anything. And on the far right, at the very end of the row, half turned like she was already trying to get back to work, blue housecoat. And I put my hand over my mouth in my own kitchen, and I said her name out loud for the first time in 31 years. Colette. It was 2 in the afternoon on the 14th of May, and I sat alone in my kitchen and I cried for 20 minutes, and then I got up and I called Delia Rourke. And Delia said, "Ellie." And I said, "Delia, I found her." And Delia said, "Found who, honey?" And I said, "Both of them." The wedding was June the 20th. And I'm not going to give you the wedding, that's not what this is. 400 people in a tent and a band, and Amelie and her grandmother's, no, not her grandmother's, in a dress from a shop. I'll give you 3 things. The first is the table. It was by the door, little round thing, 6 frames on it. Nathan's father, Amelie's godmother, Genevieve's parents both gone, and I want you to know that Genevieve Laurent put a photograph of her father on that table, and under it on a card in her own handwriting, it said, Henri Aubertin, Boucher, butcher. She wrote butcher on a card at her daughter's wedding and put it where 400 people could read it. That took her 48 years. And in the middle of that table, in the biggest frame, was a photograph of 22 people in front of a restaurant on a hill in Lyon in 1992. And under it, on a card in Victor's handwriting, Colette Laurent, Le Vieux Marché Lyon, 19 years. She's the one on the right. The second thing is Sylvie. Because Aunt Sylvie came up to me at that wedding, of course she did. I'd been at the head table for about 40 minutes, and here she came 70-something from Paris, and she stood in front of me and she did the 4-second thing, head to foot, 1 pass. And she said in French to Genevieve standing right next to me, "C'est elle. Is this her?" And Genevieve Laurent said in English, "Sylvie, this is Eleanor Whitmore. She was on the sauces at Le Vieux Marché for 6 years. Speak English or speak to her." It was 7:20 at night on June the 20th. And Sylvie's mouth opened, and I said, "Bonsoir, Sylvie," and she said, "Bonsoir," and that was the whole conversation. That was it. That's all it ever was my entire life. 30 years of being terrified of a woman like that, and it turns out it takes 4 syllables. And the third thing is my son, because at about 11 o'clock that night, when it was down to the end of it, Nathan came and found me and sat down next to me, and he had his tie in his pocket, and he said, "Mom," and I said, "Yeah, baby." And he said, "Say something." And I said, "Say what?" And my son said, "Anything," in French. "I've been waiting all night." And I looked at him, and I said, "Te voilà, je t'attendais." There you are. I've been waiting for you. And he said, "What's it mean?" And I said, "I'll tell you in Lyon." We went in September, 4 of us, me, Victor, Genevieve, and Amelie. Nathan stayed home, that's a whole other story, and it's Amelie's to tell, not mine. And I'm going to tell you about the room in Villeurbanne, and then I'm going to stop because there isn't much and there doesn't need to be. Victor could not get out of the car. We were in the parking lot for 11 minutes. I counted because I always count, and his wife sat in the back seat with her hand on his shoulder and did not say one word for 11 minutes, and I want to tell you after everything, that's the best thing I ever saw that woman do. And at minute 11, Victor Laurent said in English, "I don't know what to say to her." And I said, "Victor, you're not going in there to say something." And he said, "Then what am I going in there for?" And I said, "So she can see you." And he sat there. And then he said, "Will you come in first?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Eleanor." And I said, "Victor." I said, "No in Charleston, and I'm saying no in Villeurbanne. She's not my mother. You go in first and you go in alone, and if you want me after, I'll be right here." And Genevieve said, "Go, Victor." And he went. He was in there 40 minutes. I want to tell you something, and it's the hardest part of the whole story, and it's the part nobody wants. She didn't know him. 91 years old, and Victor Laurent walked into that room and sat down in front of his mother and said, "Maman, c'est moi." And she looked at him the way you look at a nice man who's come to fix the radiator. 40 minutes. And he came out and he got in the car and he did not cry. He sat behind the wheel and he put both hands on it and he said, "She doesn't know me." And Amélie said, "Papa." And he said, "It's all right." And I said, "Victor, let me go in." And he said, "Eleanor, there's no point. She doesn't." And I said, "Let me go in." And I went in. And I want to be very careful here because I've heard people tell this story back to me and they make it into a miracle, and it wasn't a miracle. I'm not going to sell you a miracle. She was very small. That's the first thing. That woman had gotten so small, and she was in a chair by a window, and she had her hands in her lap, the way I've had my hands in my lap my entire life. And I sat down in front of her. And I did not say, "Colette," and I did not say, "Do you remember me?" Because I'm 64, and I've buried people, and I know exactly how much cruelty is in the question, "Do you remember me?" So I sat down, and I put on the hill. I hadn't done it in 31 years. I'd been doing Madame Bouchard's French all night in Charleston boarding house French, proper French. This was different. This was flat, and it was fast, and it swallowed the ends of the words, and I let it come up out of me the way it used to come up at 6 o'clock in the morning in a cold kitchen. And I said, "Alors, Colette, debout." "Well then, Colette, up you get." And nothing happened. For about 4 seconds, nothing happened, and I sat there in a nursing home in Villeurbanne, and I thought, "You old fool." And then that woman's chin came up, and she looked at me. And Colette Laurent said, in the flat, fast accent of the hill out of a mouth that hadn't known her own son 40 minutes earlier, "Ah, l'Américaine." It was 3 in the afternoon on the 8th of September. And I said, "Oui, madame." And she said, "Tout est parti." "You left." And I said, "Oui, madame." And she said, "Sans dire au revoir," without saying goodbye. And I said, "Oui, madame, je suis désolée." And Colette Laurent looked out that window for a while, and then she said, "Les chaises," the chairs. And I said, "Oui." And she said, "Vous les remettiez toujours mal." You always put them back wrong, and that was it. That's the whole thing. That's everything I got. About 90 seconds, and then she was gone again. And she asked me if it was Thursday, and I said yes, and she was happy about that. And I sat with her for another half hour, and we didn't say anything else at all. And when I came out, Victor Laurent was standing in the parking lot with his wife and his daughter, and he looked at me, and he said, "Well," and I said, "She's in there." And he said, "What?" And I said, "Victor, she's in there. She's just not in French from Paris." And that man looked at me for about 3 seconds, and then he turned around and he walked back into that building, and he did not run, and he did not hesitate, and Geneviève Laurent watched her husband go and put her hand over her mouth. He was in there 2 hours, and I don't know what he said. I've never asked. It's his and it's hers and it isn't mine. But when he came out talking like a man from the Croix-Rousse, and he never stopped. He's still doing it. 67 years old, and he sounds like a silk printer's son in Charleston at cocktail parties, and Geneviève doesn't say a word about it. She's got a photograph of a butcher on her mantle now. Colette died the following March. 92. Victor was in the room. 15 years of nothing and then 6 months, and he went 11 times in 6 months, and he was in the room. And I want you to understand that's not a happy ending. 6 months is not 15 years. He'll carry that till he dies, and he should. But he was in the room, and I got a phone call at 11 o'clock at night in a yellow house in Marbury, North Carolina, exactly the way I got one in 1994. And this time I answered it, and this time I got on the plane. So here's what I know, and then I'm done. I sat at a table in Charleston, South Carolina, and I let 6 people talk about me in a language I'd bled for. And I did it because I'd spent 30 years believing that a woman who doesn't take up room is a woman nobody can hurt. That's not true. That's the biggest lie I ever swallowed. And I swallowed it whole, and I fed it to my husband, and I fed it to my son, and I nearly took it to my grave. They didn't make me small. They found me small. I'd been small for 30 years before Geneviève Laurent ever looked at my shoes. All she did was hand me a bill for it. And a woman in a blue housecoat, 91 years old, who didn't know her own son's face, she knew mine. 31 years later, out of a mouth that had let go of almost everything, she found the American girl who put the chairs back wrong. Because I was there. Because I was somebody once in front of somebody, and it stuck. It stuck to a wall in a woman's head for 31 years, and it outlasted her whole life. That's what happens when you let people see you. It doesn't go away. It doesn't fade. You don't lose it. You put it down, and you can pick it back up. I'm 65 years old now. I have a passport that doesn't expire until 2035, and I'm going to use every year of it. My name is Eleanor Whitmore. I was on the sauces at Le Vieux Marché in the Croix-Rousse for 6 years, and I learned my French from a woman who would not slow down, and I have never once since that night made myself smaller so somebody else could feel taller, and I never will again.